This is disc number 4.
He rarely watched the news, but when something flashed across his phone, a school shooting or a politician spewing hate, Jake felt such uneasiness and despair, as if the country was coming apart, different factions pulling it to the right and left, until violence irreparably tore it in two. And violence would beget violence. "You're right," Jake told Harold. "I can't protect her. But she and I can protect each other." "What does that mean?" "I don't know. Honestly, it sounded better in my head." It had been a while since Melissa left. Jake walked around the back of the boat, reached the broken window, a dark stain of Harold's blood from where the older man had fallen. Jake gazed out into the day. He didn't see Melissa. Didn't see anyone, just the fan of trees and the sound of unseen water lapping behind them, like an animal at a water bowl in a distant room. Jake lifted his camera and heard Harold ask, alarmed, "Who are you?" A response low and indecipherable. Fear filled Jake like light. Whoever was talking to Harold must have climbed through the window and walked around the opposite side of the boat. He and Jake had inadvertently circled each other. "Jake was just here," Harold said plaintively. And there was another low response Jake couldn't understand. He wanted to climb out the window and run off. He wanted to hide until whatever was going to happen happened. He wanted to crawl forward on his knees and beg for his life. Jake was afraid, violently afraid. "I told you!" Harold said urgently. "I don't know where they went." Jake's hands were on the windowsill, shards of glass pressed into his palms. He let go of the window, quietly walked back toward Harold, like Harold's pleading voice was a siren, luring him to danger, or a shipwrecked sailor calling for help. Jake carried the gun in one hand and the camera in the other, pressed against his chest. He crouched between the bows of two large speedboats where he could hide and watch. Peered around the corner. Jake could only see the interrogator's back, widen under a black duster and dark jeans and boots. He was bent over Harold, saying something too low for Jake to understand. The shears Melissa had found and used to cut Harold's jeans were behind the stranger. "I'm not ready," Harold said. "Please." The man stood, and Jake saw the back of his neck and the side of his cheek. Scars everywhere, burn marks like a busy road map of some congested city. Despite his fear, Jake lifted his camera. The man reached into a backpack and pulled out a bottle, squinted at the label, twisted off the cap. He poured the contents of the bottle over Harold's body. Jake smelled gasoline. Saw the small yellow gleam of a match. Jake hadn't planned on rising and running, wasn't exactly sure what he was going to do when he reached the man. He thought about abruptly changing course and turning in the other direction, and Jake actually liked that idea very much, but his body wouldn't obey his mind. He simply couldn't stop himself from running over and grabbing the man's scarred wrist and snuffing out the match. The man looked at Jake with surprise. He tried to pull his wrist free, but Jake grimly hung on. "What happened to my gun?" Jake thought. Oh no. He had no idea where the gun was. Still in his hand? No. Jake's hands were wrapped around the other man's wrists, vainly hanging on. Had he dropped it before he charged? Maybe. Strange how calm his mind was as he struggled, as the other man finally pulled one of his hands free. "Get out!" Jake screamed. Well, that scream wasn't very calm, Jake thought, still with that weird disassociation. It was like a version of him was fixed on escaping, another was determined to help Harold, a third was losing this fight, and a fourth was dismally watching everything happen. "Go!" Jake screamed. He grabbed the man's free arm again, hanging on like he was dangling from a branch that protruded from just below a cliff's edge. He wasn't even sure who he was screaming at. Harold or the stranger or himself. All of them. Begging everyone to leave the situation for the violence to end. An accidental kick sent the shears sliding toward Harold. The older man quickly cut himself loose and, for a hopeful second, Jake thought Harold might help him. But Harold just stood and hurriedly limped away. The gasoline seemed to be everywhere, in Jake's clothes and nose and hair and mouth. The other man again pulled a hand free, and Jake suddenly felt his fist. The punch was like finding out a car had run over your dog. So powerful it was emotional, and knocked Jake to the floor. A punch so transcendental it took all those versions of Jake and sent them flying back into his body. He lay flat in the pool of gasoline, stunned. I sure get punched a lot, Jake thought distantly. The scarred man stood over him and glowered down. Jake lifted a hand as the other man lifted his lighter. Chapter 13. Melissa. Melissa remembered the control she'd felt that long night when Harold kept waking up in pain, a night that had left her sleepless but far from exhausted. There was something about that situation, the stress and strain, that energized her, given her a newfound rush of being needed, and with need came something close to power. But that feeling was gone. Ever since stumbling upon the clerk's body, Melissa had barely felt conscious. She ran back to the warehouse, crying and gasping, away from violence and death, like a dream from which she couldn't wake. Melissa reached a bend in the path and stumbled off, slipped into a small outcropping of trees near the water, collapsed to the dirt, tears clouding her vision. Panic thundered through her like raging horses. That dying man on his knees at the diner. The waitress crawling into death. The murdered boy at the store. Maybe someone other than the Winterses had killed him, Melissa thought, and she hated herself for that hope. But if it hadn't been the Winterses, then his death hadn't been her fault. It was possible some other criminal had strolled into the store. Regardless, she needed to get back to Jake. Melissa finally reached the broken window, grasped the frame where it was clear of glass. She wasn't sure what she and Jake could do or where they would go. She just knew they had to leave. Death was circling once again. She saw something on the grass. Blood, drops of blood, a red path like raindrops had fallen around the warehouse. Voices inside. Melissa climbed in, lowered herself softly to the floor, walked around the edges, reached the other side of the warehouse and crept toward the yacht she and Jake were using. From the shadows of a catamaran, she saw a man standing over Jake, Jake pushing himself backward with one hand, his other raised defensively. Melissa had never seen that man until this moment, but she recognized the scars from stories she'd heard. Seth. If men like Seth had been hired to find them, then Melissa knew she and Jake were in greater danger than she'd imagined. Jake kept scooting backward, casting about desperately. Melissa spotted an open backpack on the ground, holding several glass bottles filled with a yellowish-green liquid. Again, that instinctual pull guided her, despite her fear. She stole forward, picked up one of the bottles. Seth didn't see her. She knew Jake was glancing at her and trying not to. That memory from days earlier, when she'd crept behind Chris with a wine bottle, the hit that had sent her on this path, a bloody christening like a bottle smashing against the side of a departing ship. She raised her glass weapon over Seth's head. Seth reached back and caught her hand before it lowered. Suddenly, Melissa was stumbling. He'd spun around so fast, that she hadn't even seen his other hand move, just felt his fist slam into her cheek. Melissa fell against one of the boats, a point from something hard pressed into her spine. Jake stumbled toward Seth, his camera swinging. Seth glanced over at Jake, almost casually, and grabbed him by the neck. Held him in place with one outstretched arm, squeezing as Jake dropped to his knees. Seth's other hand snaked out, slapped the bottle out of Melissa's hand, grabbed her by the hair and pulled down. Melissa couldn't break her fall as the ground rushed toward her. Her forehead smashed into the cement floor, nausea nearly overwhelming her. Patches of her hair felt like they'd been ripped out. His hand stayed on the back of her head, keeping her down, holding her in place as she struggled. Seth held Melissa by the hair and Jake by the throat, Jake's face red and cheeks puffed and eyes wide as he choked. He began walking toward the front door, dragging Jake and Melissa with him. Melissa's hands were over his, mitigating the pain from his grip, but inadvertently holding his hand in place. Her feet scrabbled behind her, struggling to keep pace. Jake was on the other side as Seth grasped his throat, feet dragging. Jake's body bent backward like a spear's tip was pressed into his spine. Seth threw them toward the giant steel door. Melissa felt herself carried as if by a merciless wind, then her palms and cheeks slapping down. Jake collapsed next to her. Seth removed a gun from his backpack and pointed it at her. Her hands rose. Melissa had long been fearful of men with guns, of the way men didn't respect their power, how they played with weapons as fantasy. Weapons were desire, and fear accompanied desire. But Seth was different. Until now, Melissa had never seen a man hold a gun who wasn't, in some way, scared. Seth kicked the door leading to the small office up front. It took one kick for the door to splinter, another for it to fall open. He strode inside. "I got Harold out," Jake told her, pushing himself next to her, his throat raspy. "This guy was going to kill him. Who is he?" "Seth," Melissa said. Chris had told her about him, in the same reverential tones usually reserved for Victor Winters and his murder. Chris had never believed his uncle had been killed by the cops or criminals. He thought a mysterious vigilante had done it, a masked mythical assailant who'd glided into Victor's house and coldly assassinated him and his girlfriend. Melissa knew that story couldn't be true, but Chris wholeheartedly subscribed to it, the way people believed in Bigfoot or how children worried about monsters. But Seth was real. A hired hitman for the Winterses, he was once set on fire by a woman he'd failed to kill. Probably the only person he'd ever failed to kill. There was an unstated hierarchy in the Winterses organization, and men like Seth were at the top. The pimps and dealers and traffickers were hard and scarred and violent and ruthless and wedded to brutality. But even they told hushed, admiring stories about Seth. For most of them, violence was a tool they employed. For Seth and the few like him, a pair of Eastern European twins, a married couple in Baltimore, a father in the suburbs of Northern Virginia. Violence was like breathing. Killing has its rules, and those who navigate that world are the ones who make the rules. Something beyond men. The Winterses bring people like him in for important jobs, she told Jake. We're important? A rumbling sound as a large warehouse door behind them lifted. Seth strode out of the office as the door loudly rose, clanged on completion. Melissa blinked into the sunlight, surprised at how bright the day was, as if she'd run from the store in a dense gray fog. A small van was alone in the parking lot. Harold's old car, some type of aged Dodge, was gone. "Get up," Seth said, the first words he'd spoken quiet and direct. She and Jake unsteadily rose to their feet and walked outside, clutching each other like an elderly couple. Jake wheezed as he walked. Melissa thought he was having problems breathing, but realized he was whispering, saying something to himself. Jake abruptly stopped and turned toward Seth. "Keep walking," Seth said, a hint of weariness in his voice. "What if you just take me?" Jake asked. "And let Melissa go?" "No. Walk." Jake removed his camera from around his neck, held it delicately, his thumb rubbing the black plastic. "You can have my camera," he said solemnly. "Jake," Melissa told him. "No." "This is a Lumix DC-FZ80, Jake went on. "It's not that expensive, but some bloggers think it's going to be a discontinued model." He wiped a spot of blood from the side of his head. "In a few years, this little camera will be worth a lot, and right now, it's a great model for beginners." Seth didn't say anything. "It just has the one lens," Jake continued, "and that can't be removed, but you might not want to. It can even see the craters on the moon. I do want the memory card, but I have a spare in the car. I'll give it to you, and I'll even throw in a travel bag, although we'd have to stop by my apartment. You can have the camera, the memory card, and the travel bag, and all you have to do is bring me to the Winterses instead of Melissa. I know they'll still come after her, but this gives her a head start. That's all I want. Melissa to have another chance." "No," Melissa said to Seth. "Don't listen to him." Jake turned toward her. "Melissa," he said urgently, "they can take me, but they can't take both of us. I can survive if I know you're alive. They can't kill me as long as I know you're out there and okay. Do you understand that?" She couldn't respond. "Why don't I just take both of you and the stupid little camera?" Seth suggested. "Well," Jake said after a moment, "you could do that." Suddenly there was a flash and Seth stepped back, hands over his eyes, the gun pressed against his forehead. Jake grabbed Melissa's hand and they turned and started to run. They reached the edge of the parking lot, and Melissa wondered why she hadn't heard a shot yet, wondered if Seth was still blinded from the camera, if his handgun had malfunctioned. Jake must have had the same thought because he stopped, turned, and that's when she heard a crack. They looked at each other, confused. And then a blossom of blood flowered near Jake's neck. He let go of her hand and sank to his knees. Jake's legs kicked as he was dragged and then shoved into the van, his hands over the wound, blood filling the spaces between his fingers. His mouth opened and closed, soundlessly, like he was underwater and drowning. Melissa's fingers were shaking, her throat hoarse and raw. She wondered if she was screaming, emitting any sounds whatsoever. She felt her tears, dizziness, that rising panic. Seth pushed her toward the van. She climbed inside, numbly, dumbly, knelt next to Jake, held his hand as he kicked. Seth was saying something distinctly, but it was like Melissa had forgotten words. Some small sentence in a threatening tone. He repeated himself, his voice raised. And then there was another explosion, but the sound was different from a gunshot. Seth shouted. Melissa turned. Through the van door, she saw a car veer into the parking lot, gravel flying out from under its tires as it skidded and swerved. The car, an old white sedan, stopped about 50 feet away. The engine roared and the car rushed forward. Seth fired and the windshield cracked and he kept firing, calmly stepped to the side of the van doors, outside Melissa's sight. The car just missed the van's swinging open door as it rocketed past. Melissa heard the sound of the car hitting Seth, like soup splattering. And she heard the car dig into the gravel again. The engine revved and the car screeched and stopped outside the van door. The front passenger window rolled down. Melissa protectively knelt in front of Jake. A woman she had never seen peered over from the driver's seat. "Where's my son?" Chapter 14. Lucky. The setting afternoon sun brought an early evening excitement, one that reminded Lucky of the twilight summer nights in his neighborhood, back when Mary Beth had been either 10 or 11, the age right before her teenage distance set in seemingly overnight. Renee relaxed and lovely as she talked to someone's wife, sitting in a lawn chair with her legs lazily crossed, a glass of wine in hand. Lucky standing in a circle of men, as he was expected to, but their conversations distant to him, lost in the evening, lost in Lucky's quiet observations of his wife and daughter. But those evenings hadn't been lit by police cars. Lucky walked back toward the cordoned-off parking lot from the warehouse, toward a pair of cops standing apart from the investigation, mounted lights illuminating every inch of torn gravel and spilled blood. His phone buzzed. Lucky pulled it halfway out of his pocket, glanced at the screen. A notification from the Watchful app. He pushed the phone back into his pocket, tried to focus on the cops' efforts to reconstruct what had happened. Towns like Wharfside didn't often come across this level of violence. He'd overheard that a CSI team from Baltimore was on the way to investigate the blood throughout the warehouse and parking lot, as well as a murder at a nearby convenience store. Lucky had gone to that store first, but hadn't been able to get inside. Even so, he'd learned that the only corpse there belonged to the clerk, not anyone he was looking for. And there was little chance the cops would learn who'd killed him. Lucky knew the nearby Baltimore cops were too busy to offer much help, and a town this small lacked the resources to conduct an effective investigation on its own, especially when the criminal knew what he was doing. Law enforcement was stretched too thin. If you kept a low profile and hid your crimes with even a slight degree of competence, no one could catch you. It was so easy to be corrupt in America that it barely felt like living a lie. "When's building management getting here?" Lucky heard a nearby cop ask another. "On the way," the other cop replied. "But coming from D.C., going to take a few hours." "Who are you with? Waiting for your team?" Those questions were directed to Lucky. "Team?" Lucky asked. "News team. I'm not media. PI." He showed the disinterested cops his badge. They didn't even glance at it. "Hired by a family searching for their son. I heard a rumor he might be in Wharfside." "What's the kid's name?" Another notification. "Jake Smith," Lucky replied, ignoring the phone vibrating in his pocket. "About 6 feet, 24, white, curly brown hair, brown eyes. Haven't seen him." "No worries. Better for his family that he wasn't here." Lucky and the two cops watched an investigator measure the distance between drops of blood. "You served before?" one of the cops asked. Strange, Lucky reflected, how distant he was from that question. Never compelled to mention his brief time in the military. "I was San Diego police," Lucky lied. "You ever work with ICE?" "All the time." The cop nodded approvingly. It was a lie Lucky had told before, claiming prior police work to help himself slip into crime scenes or gather information. Years ago, at his request, the Winterses had mocked up a fake badge for him, and he'd used that badge countless times. It was a gold oval with "Police Officer San Diego" written on it in blue, San Diego chosen since it was too far and large to easily verify. Not that after Lucky showed someone the badge, he ever stayed around long enough to answer questions. "Is the pay good as a PI?" one of the cops asked. "Not according to my wife." The cop snorted and laughed. This was something Lucky had always been good at, easing his way into any group of men. He knew what men wanted, what they trusted. Men will believe anything if it has a sense of superiority to it. For some, it was wealth, for others, strength, but the key was for that trait to be held aloft and superior. Men treasured that approach, mistook it as admirable. "You two work out of this town?" Lucky asked. "Nah, we're Salisbury. Wharfside doesn't have its own PD. Jim Carver. This is Derek Locke. Lucky Wilson." Lucky shook each of their hands. "You heard Harold's in the hospital?" Locke asked Carver. "I heard." "Harold?" Lucky asked. "Harold Thompson," Carter replied. "Old local and part-time security, mostly as charity. Probably would have greeted customers at Target if Wharfside had one, but kept an eye on the warehouse instead. Wrong place, wrong time?" Another frustrating notification. Lucky reached into his pocket and silenced his phone. He was certain the camera was picking up a neighbor walking his dog or William checking the mail, not any incriminating evidence about William and Renee. But still, at the thought of them together, Lucky forced those images away. "Looks like Harold was out here," one of the cops was saying. "Got dragged inside. Old Harold put up a fight, though. He's under right now, but they say he's going to pull through." There was so much these cops didn't know, and so much they'd never know. A call on the burner phone during Lucky's drive over had filled in these blanks ahead of time. "Lucky? The buyers pulled out, said they had a new job in a new city and couldn't commit. And their agent is going on vacation for a few days. They sent us a quick message that the property is wide open again." This one was easy for Lucky to decipher. Jake and Melissa had escaped and left town, and the person searching for them had been laid up, left with wounds that required medical care and a few days off. The property is wide open. The search for Jake and Melissa was still on. Investigators were documenting everything inside, and Lucky had caught only a quick glance. But that had been enough. He'd seen the smashed window on the other side of the building, the broken door to an office, the bloody path from the center of the room. The scent of gasoline. The blood might have seemed like one of the most prominent clues in the investigation, but the real clue, Lucky knew, was the gas. The man who had spilled it was named Seth Yates. Lucky had trained him. A few years ago, he'd been asked by the Winterses to take Seth under his tutelage. He'd thought the young man would be impetuous and flamboyant, like most dumb, immature criminals. But instead, Lucky met someone hardened and serious. Saw that Seth was driven by anger and revenge, hatred of the scars a fire had mapped over his face and body. Lucky channeled that rage, taught Seth the importance of death over desire. The Winterses were never interested in sending a message or torturing someone to prove a point. Death was the most effective message there was, particularly when the death appeared natural or as the result of an accident. None of their methods caused attention, and that was the precise outcome the Winterses wanted. Seth chose fire. Houses set ablaze, offices burned to the ground, a corpse found unconscious in a smoke-filled kitchen. He studied the science of fire, even considered being trained as a volunteer firefighter, but Lucky quickly dissuaded him of that notion. He knew that if these fires were ever investigated, those with training would be suspect. Seth's scars and demeanor made him memorable. Instead, it was Lucky who took the training. A few weekend classes offered by the local FD focused on what to do if a fire occurred in different situations. Lucky took careful notes and gave his findings to Seth. And then, after a few months, they parted ways. Seth seemed confused by this, as if he'd expected Lucky to remain a mentor to him, to keep in contact as friends, but that was the final lesson Lucky wanted to teach. Never mix your professional and personal lives. The only person Lucky had ever trusted with the Winterses was Ruby, and he forever had the knowledge that she could betray him. He'd helped her escape, and, if she was found, he had no assurance that she wouldn't turn on him. It would have been better to have never trusted anyone. "If you don't mind me asking," Carver asked, "how much money are we talking?" Lucky blinked back to the conversation. I hope that's not personal, Carver added. Locke's head was tilted as he listened to the radio mic on his shoulder. Just curious. Depends how successful you are, Lucky said. This was a question he'd been asked before, one he'd researched. Starting out, you might make in the 20s. Once you get established, maybe 3 times that. That's it? Sorry. Damn. Hey, Locke said. We need to look at the tracks. They're thinking we could have multiple victims. Okay. Carver didn't seem particularly motivated to look into the case. So, what? You get your license and go right to work? Or did you work with someone first? I heard you have to apprentice. Lucky could have continued this conversation, kept on fabricating a story that he'd told before, but his phone buzzed again and he finally gave in, pulled it out, glanced at the watchful notification. 1 second, Lucky said, and he lifted his phone. I need to take this. He walked away from Carver and Locke, away from the conversations occasionally punctuated by laughter in the warehouse. Over to his car at the end of the lot, a few spaces away from the police automobiles. A younger cop was back there, vaping and staring down into his phone. Lucky strode past him, opened his own car door, climbed inside. Shut and locked it. Closed his eyes tight. Realized he was gripping the phone so hard he was in danger of shattering the screen. Lucky stared out the windshield at the dark night, at the silhouettes of trees like sentries waiting to be told what to do. Lucky swiped open his phone, tapped the app. He pressed it too long and an option appeared to delete it, the app trembling on a screen with a small X in the corner. Lucky briefly considered the idea, the bliss of ignorance from not knowing what was on the camera. Instead, he opened the camera to its live view. Renee's car was parked in William's driveway. Lucky didn't even wipe the tears off his cheeks, just stared down at the phone. He watched the door to the house open, saw William McKenna standing in the doorway. Lucky squinted and imagined he could see the smile on William's face. The car door opened, but it wasn't Renee who stepped out. Lucky watched his daughter run over to William McKenna, watched her disappear into his embrace, and then pull back and kiss him. William made a laughing sound the camera picked up, held Mary Beth away, glanced up and down the street. Then he took her hand and pulled her inside and closed the door. His daughter. His 17-year-old daughter. The screen cracked under Lucky's thumbs. Part 2. You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. John chapter 8, verse 44. Chapter 15. Melissa. I like that, Jake told her. It gives you something different, something special. Don't smile. They sat on a grassy hill after he took that first set of photos. A sunny day in Baltimore's Patterson Park, the summer still too young for Baltimore's brutal humidity. A boy and his father kicked a soccer ball back and forth. Another couple was on a blanket to their right, the woman sitting up and the man lying on his back. Can I see the pictures? Melissa asked. She slid next to Jake, pulled her dyed red-brown hair over her shoulder, peered down at the camera. She'd never had pictures taken by a professional photographer. The photo shoot had been Chris's idea, inspired by the photos of a friend's wife. Lately, Chris had always seemed inspired this way. What someone else had, he wanted. The friend's wife, Janet or Janice, Melissa wasn't sure which, and because she'd already met her, was too embarrassed to ask. Had shown her own photos to Melissa and a group of wives and girlfriends a few weekends before. Black and white pictures she was getting framed. You probably saw them when I posted them on Insta a month or so ago, Janet/Janice told them, and the other women assented they had. Melissa had been surprised to discover, over the rest of that afternoon, that the photos actually changed how she regarded Janet/Janice. Melissa had only met her that day, and had seen her as somewhat shallow, empty, the kind of woman Chris's friends tended to date or marry, and, she was certain, no different from how they saw her. But the pictures changed that impression, particularly one where Janet/Janice was glancing down, eyes away from the camera, conveying a sadness Melissa would never have suspected. She showed that picture to Chris before they left. "You like that?" he asked. "You want some old photos of you too?" "I just think they're so pretty." And now Melissa looked at the photos Jake had taken, one where she was staring at the camera, unsmiling but with a gleam in her eye. An excitement Jake had somehow spotted and captured. Melissa didn't recognize herself. It wasn't just how she looked. Something else about the picture drew her. How Jake saw her. "I don't know where I am," Melissa said. Jake's mother sat next to her, slumped with her hands wrapped around the back of her neck. She didn't look up as she spoke. "We're at Steve Debko's. He's a friend and a doctor." "I don't remember you telling me that." "That's because you're still in shock." Ruby kept staring down at the floor. "You asked me where we were going 3 times on the way here." "Dr. Steve, your friend, he can help, Jake?" Melissa asked. Ruby didn't answer. Melissa stood and walked over to the kitchen window and stared out at the neglected lawn, fading from green to gray, the bright colors of day changing to a black and white evening. "You knew who he was," Ruby said softly, as if to herself. Melissa didn't know how to respond. "You knew who he was," Ruby said again. "You were with Chris Winters. You knew the kind of danger Jake would be in. This is your fault." Melissa remembered the day after that long first photo shoot in Baltimore, the text from Jake thanking her for her time, the way she relentlessly analyzed the closing words. "And I loved your sunset eyes." She'd told Chris about the photo shoot, how Jake had taken her to different parts of Baltimore she hadn't yet seen. Highland Town's Patterson Park, the tree-filled neighborhoods of Bolton Hill, the quirky, festive goofiness of Hampton. She'd lived near the city with Chris for years and felt like she had never seen any of it. "So you had fun," Chris replied. Melissa wondered, suddenly, if she was too excited, talking too much about another man. But Chris was staring down into his phone, pressing the screen with alternating thumbs, the slow way he texted. Melissa often wondered if that was why her texts with girlfriends were so much more detailed, their fingers smaller and nimble. Or maybe men were always more reserved. "I did," she said, and then added brightly to make what she was saying about Chris. "I think you'll really like the pictures." "Cool." She wondered who Chris was texting. Melissa knew a lot of what Chris was involved with couldn't be discussed. She understood that, had grown used to it long ago, the way someone might accept their partner's drinking, a cautious eye toward excess without realizing excess was already upon them. Like the gun collection that had proliferated in the closet. The quiet men who came by late at night, whom Chris led to that room in the basement. Even the video she'd seen of that man being killed. The images that she'd forced herself not to think about. What wouldn't she accept? Melissa had been so terrified the night after she'd seen that video over Chris's shoulder. She'd lain awake afterward, alone in bed, tears wetting her pillow. And then she somehow fell into a deep, dreamless sleep and woke the next morning with Chris gone, the sun out, the video a memory that glaringly returned. But it was easier hours later, a morning later. That dread in her, the fear rock, was smaller. There was a city outside her window, and it moved and lived and breathed And so there was something else she was part of. Melissa thought about the pictures Jake had taken, how he'd talked to her, how they'd walked through Baltimore together, and she longed to see him again. How she longed to see him again. To hear his voice, for Dr. Steve to walk up the stairs and tell her and Ruby that Jake was going to recover. But there was no sound from the stairs or basement. Nothing but silence after Ruby's accusation. We knew we were in trouble, Melissa told Ruby. Jake and I tried to stop seeing each other, but I loved him and— But it's so small now, isn't it? Ruby interrupted her. The bad things we do are always small compared to their consequence. The Lord will repay you for your sins. Melissa quickly accepted when Jake invited her out for drinks. She was determined to prove this was casual, that she was only making a new friend, even quietly telling herself as she applied eyeliner in the bathroom. This doesn't mean anything. What'd you say? Chris was lying on their bed in his boxers, watching men fight each other in a cage on his laptop. Nothing. She and Jake met at night for what she told herself wasn't a date. That was reaffirmed when she saw what he was wearing. Jeans and an old faded t-shirt, which stood in sharp contrast to her short, olive green romper with a diving neckline and black platform heels that laced around her calves. It wasn't a date, Melissa told herself. She just loved dressing up. She wouldn't go on a date with another man. She let those words drum into her mind. Wow, Jake said when he saw her. I should have dressed up. It's okay, because this wasn't a date. His gaze kept darting to her legs, and she suddenly felt uncomfortable. You carry that everywhere? Melissa pointed at the camera on his chest. Jake looked surprised, then touched the camera. Pretty much, he said. It's kind of like my best friend. Melissa thought that was cute, and then she was curious. But your phone has a camera, right? Yeah, Jake said, suddenly serious. But you lose so much with a phone. The sensors just don't compare, and that affects the number of pixels, and it destroys the light in your work. You can't really tell when you view most phone photos on their screens, but if you blow them up, the elements get blurred or distorted. The biggest problem for me, though, is the lack of lenses. I have a decent stable of lenses that I can use with this camera, and they all offer different. Basically, Melissa interrupted, you like using that camera more. He blinked, smiled that cute smile again. Basically, yeah. I'm sorry, she said. Was that rude? Nah, even I was losing me. Jake and Melissa walked around the harbor. National Harbor sat near the borders of D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, a recent development of shops and restaurants and hotels that the local business community hoped would bring the capital's relentless flock of tourists outside the city. The Awakening, a sculpture famous to D.C. residents, had been taken from Haynes Point and moved here, a giant stone arm and hand and head straining to emerge from the water's edge. A Ferris wheel slowly spun, offering a view of Washington's landmarks from its highest location. A singer sang on a street corner, accompanied by a guitarist, collecting change from pedestrians passing by. This is nice, he told her. Melissa agreed. But why are we here? He asked. Is this a date? No, she should have replied. Yes, she wanted to tell him. I don't know, Melissa said. Why are we here? She asked. You forgot again? Ruby snapped. No, I'm sorry. Melissa felt too broken to do anything but apologize. I mean, can we go to a hospital? Jake should be in a hospital. An urgency rose, the thought that Jake might die. He should be in a hospital. He'd never get out, you know that. Bullet wounds bring the police, and the police bring the Winterses. Noises from downstairs. Melissa looked to the door in the kitchen that led to the basement where, hours earlier, she and Ruby and Dr. Steve had half-carried, half-dragged Jake. Jake bleeding and crying out in pain, Melissa numbly watching while Dr. Steve hurriedly placed a cover on a pool table in the center of the room, and then the three of them lifted Jake onto it. Dr. Steve told them to wait upstairs, but Melissa had been unable to move, and then Dr. Steve shouted, and Ruby's hand was suddenly on her arm, pulling her backward. Melissa wanted Jake to look at her, wanted to see promise in his eyes, hear strength in his voice, wanted to know that if she left him in this basement with Dr. Steve, she could return to him later. If she stayed with him, Melissa felt, he'd live. Jake would live. And he might never be the same, but he'd live. Melissa knew the effects of bullet wounds, had heard stories from Chris about people he'd known who'd been shot, and she had a friend whose cousin had been shopping in a mall in Maryland when a pair of young men with rifles had stalked through, casually firing into stores, killing over a dozen and wounding 3 times that many, and a bullet in her friend's cousin's gut had left her forever limping, resigned to a colostomy bag, her insides tattered. But she'd lived. Melissa would accept that, of course, patiently stay by Jake's side as he recovered, this penance for their lust. The Lord repaying her for their sins. "He's asleep," Dr. Steve had said, the only time he'd left Jake and come upstairs. "I had to put him out. He was moving too much. Losing too much blood." Neither Ruby nor Melissa said anything. "The bullet is lodged in his clavicle," Dr. Steve went on. "After I cleaned up the wound, I could even see it protruding. But he's lucky. The subclavian artery is close to the entry, but it's safe. Jake's alive, but he'll only stay alive if you take him to the hospital." "No," Ruby said. "I know you can't. And I also know you can't stay here for long." Dr. Steve's words were heavy. "So the next option is to remove the bullet." "You can do that?" Melissa asked. "I don't have a choice. If that bullet stays there, there's a chance of infection, of rupture, of death, particularly if he's going to be moving a lot. And chances are he's going to be moving a lot. I'm going to keep him under until he has the surgery, but there will be a couple of times you can speak with him." "Thank you so much," Melissa said, and she heard the emotion in her voice. She couldn't help it, the combination of fear and gratefulness and deference. Dr. Steve went back downstairs. "Steve's a real doctor," Ruby told her. "Not a vet or chiropractor or something else." "How do you know him?" "I saved him from the Winterses." Melissa thought about that. "Jake told me a little about you," Melissa said to Ruby, "but he never said what you did for them." "That's because he never knew." Melissa gathered Ruby didn't want to talk. She didn't press her further, just stood and paced, and thought relentlessly about Jake. Love was relentless and inevitable, like Melissa's life had been a wasteland of snow, and love was summer and sun and children joyfully shouting. Jake dared her, texting her that he was outside her house, asking her to step out for just a kiss, a quick touch. And his desire sparked hers. "Where are you going?" Chris would ask as he cleaned a gun, the now familiar smell of polish and metal, and Melissa would tell him she'd forgotten her phone in the car, and hope on her way out the door that Chris didn't realize she was actually holding her phone. Melissa would step outside. No, she'd fly outside, not even conscious of the steps from the front door, and then rush around the back to the yard where Jake waited. His lips against hers, the rough brush of his whiskers against her cheek. Melissa was in a place she'd never been, drunk off desire, as boy-crazy as she'd ever felt. A love full-throated and raw and obsessive, placed before everything and putting everything else as secondary in importance. She obsessed over him, ached in response to his words. And Jake seemed to realize this with an almost unconscious coolness. Or maybe she was just that affected, his smile seeming to hold secrets. The way he looked at her, how she could almost feel his gaze on her body. They made games of teasing each other, sly kisses in the back seat of his car, parked around the corner from her house, daring the other to go farther, his hands under her shirt, her tugging his belt. She'd return home to Chris, worried that the scruff on Jake's cheek had left her face red, worried he would somehow sense or smell the other man on her. And maybe a year earlier, Chris would have. But then again, a year earlier, maybe she wouldn't have turned to someone else. Melissa often wondered if that was the case, if Jake would have remained just a photographer Chris had hired. She tried to separate the two, didn't want her attraction to Jake to be nothing but a result of her failing relationship with Chris. She still would have been attracted, Melissa imagined, but she wouldn't have acted on it. Just been left wondering how happy she could have been. "You should come downstairs." Melissa hadn't heard the door leading to the steps open, had no idea Dr. Steve was behind her. "He's awake?" Ruby asked uncertainly, her voice young and confused, like a young girl's. But Dr. Steve had already left. Melissa turned and she and Ruby glanced at each other, just long enough for each woman to notice the fear in the other's eyes, not long enough to hold a gaze, not long enough for comfort. Melissa followed Dr. Steve down, one hand on the railing and the other on the wall of the narrow stairway. Ruby stayed in the kitchen. "We can just leave," Jake told her. They'd spent days together in Jake's apartment. Chris was out of town. He'd told her that he needed to visit family in upstate New York and would be gone a week, and Melissa had only returned to their house to feed his pet fish and change clothes. The rest of her time was with Jake in his apartment, laughing and lost, immersed in embraces, their bodies rarely not touching. "Leave?" Melissa asked. "Like the city?" "Leave him," Jake urged her. "Go to your place, pack a bag." And there was that power, that suggestion of choice she'd never seriously considered before. The idea of hope. Why not leave? Why not leave Chris and this life of fear? Melissa thought about it through the evening, staring at some home renovation show in Spanish while, next to her in bed, Jake peered into his camera. To Melissa, this wasn't a small thing, watching a television show in Spanish while Jake was with her. Like Chris, Jake barely paid attention to her show. Chris would have played Candy Crush on his phone and Jake was scanning photographs, but there was a visible annoyance in Chris whenever Melissa watched something in Spanish or spoke the language to her friends or relatives or talked about visiting her birth country again. She wondered if it was jealousy, this connection he couldn't experience. Or maybe it was suspicion, the way paranoia had stolen over Chris the closer he'd grown to his family. But Jake had the opposite reaction. He liked when Melissa spoke Spanish, even if he barely understood it. He asked her to teach him, to tell him the names of furniture in a room, the things they viewed from his bedroom window on the street below, the parts of her body she wanted him to kiss. Melissa hadn't realized how much this side of her had been silenced. "I'm going to pack tomorrow," Melissa announced. Jake smiled as he stared into his camera. That night, like every night that week, they were lost in love, falling asleep together, waking together, not caring that there was a chance that they might die for each other. The covers a tangled rope wrapped around their bodies. Melissa waited at the bottom of the stairs before entering the large basement rec room where they'd carried Jake. She couldn't turn the corner. Seeing him meant realizing his fate. He could be sitting up, an exhausted smile on his face, white bandages wrapped around his shoulder and chest, or he could be lying down on the table, eyes looking at nothing. Melissa was too frightened. She went back up the stairs and didn't even make it to her chair. She sank to the kitchen floor, arms wrapped around herself. Jake had never been to the house, and Melissa hadn't realized how large Chris's home was compared to Jake's apartment. Or Melissa had realized it, but hadn't considered how it would look from Jake's perspective. How small it might make him feel. "It's not legal," she told him, calling from the bedroom as she carried dresses from the closet to the bed. "None of this is." "Yeah," he called back to her wryly. "That's a shame." Instinctively, Melissa had started analyzing her clothes, matching outfits as she brought them out of the closet, rather than doing what she'd imagined and simply throwing all her clothes into suitcases and sorting them later. She couldn't take everything in one trip, of course, but she could take enough to last her for a week or two, enough to get her started before she decided on the next step. She closed the first suitcase, dragged it off the bed, wincing at the sound when it landed heavily on the floor. There was no way she could carry it out to the car, so she went to find Jake. He was sitting in the dining room, his hands flat on his knees. Chris stood next to him holding a handgun. Melissa suddenly realized how wrong she'd been, how easily she'd naively assumed everything would go. Her relationship with Chris had, for all intents, already ended. But now she understood that Chris hadn't seen it that way whatsoever. "Who's this?" Chris asked, anger in his voice, hurt across his face. Jake and Melissa both flinched when Chris pointed at Jake with his gun. "Don't hurt him," Melissa said, and as she spoke, she realized her second mistake. Now Chris knew Jake mattered to her. His expression and hands both tightened, and Melissa knew her life was destined to change forever, and only for the worse. "Is he alive?" Ruby asked. "I don't know," Melissa told her. "I couldn't make myself go into the room." "You're the reason he's here." Ruby didn't soften her glare. "So get down there and find out what you did." I can't." "Whore," Ruby said, breathing the word out. Melissa's back tightened like a whip had lashed it. "Get down there, whore!" Ruby's voice rose. She began to scream. "Get down there! Get down there! To send thee into hell!" Chapter 16. Lucky. Lucky glanced at the text on his burner. "Respond." The coy codes from the Winterses were gone. He shoved the phone into his pocket. All his thoughts were on Mary Beth and William McKenna, his daughter's happy, youthful bounce into William's spread arms, his waiting smile. Lucky held the steering wheel so tightly that his hands felt like they were going to rip it apart. His mind was a spinning compass, refusing to stop in any certain direction. Lucky pushed open his car door, staggered up the walkway to his home. He'd never been shot, but imagined this was what it must feel like. A gaping pain in his side, so intense that he pressed his palm against it. Difficulty breathing, couldn't stand straight. Eyes blurred by pain. "Hey, Dad." So muddled that he hadn't even heard the car pulling up and parking on the street behind him, the car door closing, Mary Beth approaching from behind. He turned toward her. "Jesus," Mary Beth said. "Are you okay?" Lucky wanted to yell at her, grab her, hold her, sob. Her insolence shook him, asking if he was okay, even though she knew she was ruining his life. He looked away. "Just some bad news about work." "'Kay." Mary Beth walked past him to the door. He watched his daughter, stared into the back of her head as she fumbled with a house key. Sadness at the memory of her head when she was a baby, and then a little girl when he'd marveled at how small she was. A little person full of emotions and attitude and intelligence, part Renee and part Lucky and part something else, something entirely unexpected. Uniquely, uncontrollably Mary Beth. He followed his daughter into their house. "Aren't you home a little late?" Lucky asked. "Dad," Mary Beth said, her voice full of that teenage annoyance of having to deal with the stupidest person in the world. "Mom sent me to the drugstore. She has a migraine." "She does?" "Yes." Mary Beth held up a brown paper bag with CVS printed on the front, pulled out a box of Excedrin migraine, shook it, headed into the kitchen. Lucky rubbed his eyes and he thought about William's open arms and Mary Beth, and he again remembered her as a baby, the way Lucky had held her tight in his own arms, his lips pressing the top of her head, her soft wisps of hair. He heard himself whimper. Lucky covered his mouth with his hands and wondered, very calmly, if he was losing his mind. Recently, it was something Lucky had considered. He used to have the ease of compartmentalization. Lucky was able to be two different people, and they may have bled into each other on occasion, but he could separate them. The man who worked for the Winterses was a completely different person than the putzer who loved his family and sold real estate. But something about that dividing line had blurred, still visible, but barely, like an erased pencil line in Mary Beth's homework when she was in elementary school. Lucky wondered if one was affecting the other, the violence invading the love like a neighboring country attacking. And the more he invested into his family, the less real his other life seemed. Sometimes Lucky imagined himself strapped to a bed in a mental hospital, only imagining his life, the reality of his existence appearing in flickers. He could almost feel the straps around his wrists and ankles, biting into his skin, gnawing into bone until Lucky shook his head, forced those thoughts away, retreated back into reality. He walked into the kitchen and reached for the counter, felt the marble under his fingers, cold and hard and real. Mary Beth was filling a glass with water from the fridge, the determined hum of the dispenser, the sound of water rising. Lucky waited until she finished, and then he pulled out a glass and filled one for himself. Drank greedily. He hadn't realized how thirsty he was. "How was your trip?" Mary Beth asked. She was struggling to twist off the Excedrin cap. Lucky held out his hand and she gave him the medicine. He squeezed it open, handed it back. "Fine. Sell anything?" It wasn't that kind of trip. He could tell that his daughter had already lost interest. "Oh, Dad, I wanted to ask you, is it okay if I stay over at Elena's this weekend?" "Elena?" "We have this project due for biology and we were going to work on it this weekend. And then she said I should just spend the night." Lucky was certain Mary Beth was lying. She wanted to spend the night with William. She'd probably already arranged it with Elena, one of her friends that Lucky knew well. The girl's parents, a pair of lawyers who had live-in help for Elena and their two younger twins. Elena had spent the night at their house before. She and Mary Beth lost in either giggles or their phones. That change in Mary Beth. The indifference whenever she was around a girlfriend. "Okay, Dad." "Why doesn't she just stay here?" Lucky offered grimly. "We could order pizza." "You know Elena doesn't eat bread," Mary Beth told him. "And she already asked. Plus, they have a nicer place." Mary Beth's offhand remark was like a slap. Heat stirred within him, indignation at her casual contempt. The house he and Renee had bought, and the life they'd provided, and the money they'd sacrificed, all for Mary Beth, and she had the audacity to dismiss it simply because their house, admittedly, Lucky knew, wasn't as nice as her friends' parents. That was a cruelty of children Lucky had long ago accepted, one every parent knew. The lengthily prepared meal met with groans, the mocking of older fashion, the realization that your young children prefer to spend more time with their friends than with you. But those instances were eventual, dreaded but expected. Mary Beth was old enough to know better. She knew she was hurting him. Lucky didn't want to say anything else, didn't want to continue this conversation. I can take those to your mother. He pointed at the 2 pills in her hand. Mom always gets these headaches whenever you go away. Love, right? Right. Mary Beth pulled out her phone. Lucky was surprised she'd gone that long without it in her hand, and he left his daughter in the kitchen. There was such an urge in him to grab the phone, see who she was texting, find messages between her and William, and reveal that he knew the truth of what was happening. But that was something, Lucky consoled himself, he could do soon. First, he had to talk with Renee. Lucky was halfway up the stairs when the burner buzzed again. He glanced at the message. Now. Lucky opened the bedroom door, peeked inside. Renee was sleeping. He let her sleep, pocketed the pills, headed back down the stairs. Moments later, he was in his backyard office, securely locking the door behind himself. He pulled out the phone, dialed a number. He'd memorized this number years ago, but this was the first time he'd ever called it. Okay, Lucky said. There was an audible click and the line immediately disconnected. Within seconds, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. They want to know where you went, one of the unseen women. He noticed the language she used. Still shadowy, cagey, not using that cryptic messaging, but also not direct. They. Are you still working? She asked. I am. Someone picked them up. Lucky wasn't entirely sure what that meant, wondered if another assassin had captured Jake and Melissa. It's over? No. A pause as she sought a way to clarify her clue. Someone was working with them. Lucky thought back to the warehouse. There hadn't been any indication that anyone besides Jake, Melissa, or Seth was involved. Any idea who? No. But clearly someone had rescued Jake and Melissa and hidden them away, and overpowered Seth and disappeared. The job is more important now. Are you working? The woman asked again. I told you I was. You're at your house. We need you working. Lucky sighed, and the sigh surprised him. He wasn't given to displays of emotion. For a moment, he was reminded of Mary Beth and her insolence. Hello? The woman's insistence brought him back. Yes, I'm still working, Lucky said. I'll find them. A pause. The boy is hurt. The boy is hurt. Jake Smith is wounded. Seth must have told them that, although clearly he hadn't told them much. Jake was wounded and, along with Melissa, had been rescued, but not taken to the hospital. We don't have a lot of time, the woman said, and we don't know where they went. Lucky stayed silent. Do you know where they might have gone? No, but he was lying. Lucky softly pushed open the door and headed into the dark bedroom. He didn't turn on the lights as he walked over to the bed and set the pills on Renee's nightstand next to a copy of some book she was reading. She always read at night, before bed, novels that she immersed herself in, telling Lucky about the characters as if she'd made friends with them, excited or exasperated with their decisions. I'm awake, Renee said. Got a headache? He asked. Renee moved in the dark to the pills, swallowed them dry, disregarding the glass of water. Lucky watched her outline, her hands pressed against her forehead. Had a migraine, but it's getting better. I don't want to die anymore, so yay? Lucky had spent the last month relentlessly wondering about Renee's infidelity, about the sanctity of their marriage, his fears about its dissolution, and now all that angst was gone. Despite the crushing weight of Mary Beth's relationship with William, there was a small sliver of relief for Lucky. As if he'd been buried under a pile of rocks, but through a crack saw the sun. Renee lay back, fists on her forehead. "We need to talk," she said. "We do?" Not surprise in his voice, Lucky realized, but hope. Perhaps they knew the same thing about Mary Beth. "I know you didn't go look at some property down in Virginia the other night," Renee told him. "What?" Renee's voice in the dark, not tethered by pain, but anger. "You're lying to me." Lucky took a step back. He felt like he was standing near some type of vortex, a swirling black hole behind him that was about to send him somewhere else, turn him into a different person in a different relationship in a different world. "Who is she?" Renee asked. "She? Who are you seeing, Lucky? Who is she?" "I'm not seeing anyone." Renee reached over to the nightstand, snapped on the lamp. Her brown curled hair, tinged with gray, framed her face on the pillow. The lines around her eyes were pronounced. She looked hurt and sad. Whenever Lucky looked at her for more than a few moments, his heart ached. And he felt like months had passed since he'd last seen her. "I'm not with anyone else." Lucky could almost feel that vortex swirling, like the time he and Renee and Mary Beth had gone whitewater rafting, and they'd heard thundering water around the corner of a bend. The way that the water had pulled them toward it, the fear that their paddles would prove useless, that nature was stronger than anything they could realize. "Really?" Hate and sarcasm in Renee's tone. "Then where were you? Why did I get a notification about a charge on our credit card from a hotel in D.C.? He'd used the wrong credit card. "I promise I've never cheated on you." "What were you doing?" He had to give her an honest answer, even if the answer would tear their lives in half. But Lucky didn't want to lie anymore. "Come with me to the office out back," he told her. "I'll show you." Chapter 17. Ruby. "He's asleep," Melissa said brokenly. "Dr. Steve said that's okay." She didn't say anything after that, just stood in the corner by the window, crying. Ruby hated her. She hated Melissa's tears, her helplessness, the way Melissa's flesh had failed her and her heart had followed. Her dislike was so intense that Ruby knew it was unnatural. She'd lost control when she'd screamed at Melissa, and now she felt like she had to force herself to stay on steady ground. She tried to analyze her hate. Perhaps it was some latent jealousy, a maternal longing because her son had chosen another woman. But Ruby didn't think so. More likely, it was how Melissa let everything happen to her, did nothing to control her fate. Melissa looked at her, her eyes wide with worry. Ruby scowled back. Melissa looked away. Ruby remembered how she used to come back to her apartment past midnight and find Jake sleeping on the couch, 5 years old and under a blanket with a television on and his pull-up heavy with pee. She'd carry him to his bed and change him and lie behind him, her arms over his thin body, his hand in hers, fingers wet from where he'd nervously chewed his nails until he'd fallen asleep. "Dr. Steve says it's better for Jake to go to a hospital somewhere," Melissa was telling her, hands wringing. "He worries," Ruby said. She'd seen another side of Steve when she and Lucky had met with him at midnight at his old house, a giant home in Bethesda where Debco lived alone. He'd been waiting for them outside, carrying suitcases, fear like a rash on his face. For years, he'd secretly healed gunshot gangsters and stitched up stab wounds, making money to do this work and keep it a secret. Until the day he healed a woman named Blake, a woman Ruby had met and was fond of, and who had nearly been beaten to death by her boyfriend, a member of the Winterses. Debco saved her, did what he could to heal her bruises, put her in touch with a woman's rescue organization that spirited her away. But it didn't take long for the Winterses to find Blake. And then they found out Debco had helped her. Ruby owed him for helping Blake, and she had talked to Lucky, and the two of them had secretly worked out a plan to save him. Steve Debco had left behind his home, his name, and his practice. But he lived. "I just want to do what's best for him," Melissa said. Ruby supposed she could see why Jake liked her. Melissa was pretty even in distress. Dark hair and wide, deer brown eyes, sun-dipped skin, her body filled with that effortless youth that seemed it would last forever. "You know how they found you?" Ruby asked. Her voice ached from screaming earlier. "I don't know. I thought we were really careful." "Careful, like at the diner?" After the diner, we were careful." Ruby wondered what her relationship with Melissa would have been like had she traditionally met her son's girlfriend. Jake bringing her to her home one night, Melissa sitting next to him, nervous on the couch while Jake cracked jokes. She still wouldn't have liked her. "So you didn't go out?" Ruby asked. "When you were at the boat place?" "I went to a store a couple of times. The second time the guy who worked there had been killed. That's when I knew they'd come." Melissa looked away. "Maybe that's how they found us? Maybe that clerk told someone?" "Maybe," Ruby allowed. "Or maybe you two did something else." Ruby heard it in her voice. A sense of blame she wanted to assign, guilt needing to be placed. A shark captured in a net, the ocean water churning as it searches for an escape. "I don't think Jake and I did anything wrong," Melissa said. Ruby kept her emotions in check, stopped herself from yelling, from grabbing the younger woman by the shoulders and shaking her until her neck snapped. Human anger, Ruby reminded herself, does not give what the Lord desires. "How'd you get involved with Jake?" she asked instead, irritation filling her words.
This is the end of disc number 4. Please insert disc number 5. This is disc number 5.
He was taking pictures of me. We hired him to take pictures of me. My ex-boyfriend wanted them. Chris Winters. Melissa looked away. He wasn't great. That was all that needed to be said. That communication unique to women, where something wrong is conveyed in a short, understated phrase. "How did you find us?" Melissa asked. "A man stopped by my place," Ruby said. "He was looking for the two of you, and then later he called and told me where you were. He's a friend." "Was he with the Winterses or the cops?" "If he was with the cops, then he's with the Winterses," Ruby reminded Melissa. "But he's not a cop. He was gathering information on you. Said he'd been hired to find you and bring you back. His name is Lucky Wilson." "I never heard of him." "He's one of their killers, like Seth." "Oh." The word faint, as if it came from someone lost inside a cave. "They're going to find you again," Ruby warned her. "Soon. But we can't go anywhere right now. Jake needs to recover. He's not going to unless we get ahead of them. That's why I need to know who else saw you. Who knew where you were? Someone must have slipped up." Melissa was shaking her head helplessly, and then she slowly stopped. Ruby saw realization spread across the younger woman's expression. Eric Eric Liu. Jake called him when we were there. Eric's back? He's been back for years. You knew him? I knew his mom. They used to be our neighbors. The short sentence unintentionally weighed the air, but they moved away. I don't know about that. I just know he's Jake's best friend. Jake called him, and I think he told him where we were hiding. Where's Eric living now? He's at Highland Towers in Alexandria. Of course he is, Ruby thought. She stood, grabbed her purse, hunted for her keys, and remembered she'd left them on a table in the hall after cleaning Seth's blood off her car. Are you going? Melissa asked, panic in her voice. What about Jake? Ruby left Melissa in the kitchen. Ever since hearing Eric Liu's name, it was as if Ruby's hearing had lessened until it was a dull roar, like rushing wind, and she heard the voice of the Lord, urging her to rid the world of its evil. Chapter 18. Lucky. For some reason, Lucky couldn't remember which of his keys opened the door to his backyard office. It didn't help that Renee was standing behind him, cold and impatient, wearing a long coat over the shorts and t-shirt she wore to bed, her feet in an old pair of boots she used for gardening. Lucky tried another key but had trouble fitting it into the lock. You've used keys before, right? Renee asked. He kept wondering if he'd left anything revealing in the office. Lucky was fastidious about putting everything away, and, even if his wife or daughter had come inside, that anything incriminating was hidden. A Glock 22, box of bullets, stiletto dagger, and taser were under a loose floorboard, and that floorboard was under a rug. Everything else in the small single-room office was a mix of real estate folders and files intended to bore anyone snooping around. He had another hiding spot in the house. A pair of duffel bags filled with similar supplies buried in attic insulation. The attic was accessed through the closet in his primary bedroom, and, as far as Lucky knew, neither Renee nor Mary Beth had ever been inside. He tried another key, his mouth dry at the thought of what they were about to discuss. The doorknob turned. I felt this conversation was better to have here, Lucky told her. I didn't want to talk in the house. I figured you were stalling to come up with a good story. Renee walked in and immediately stopped. Where did you get that coat rack? From a diner. I like it. Renee sat in his chair, gave it a slight spin, rubbed her arms together and crossed her legs, her entire body huddled from the cold and, Lucky realized, from him. Tense as a trap and poised to snap if he came close. Lucky pulled out his phone, opened the camera app, found the video from earlier that evening. He handed the phone to his wife. He'd left his other phone inside the house and turned off. It had been constantly buzzing with messages from the Winterses, but Lucky was too heartsick to even think about the search for Jake and Melissa. What's this video? Renee asked. And what happened to your screen? Lucky ignored her second question. It's Mary Beth. He watched Renee's face as the video played, concern overtaking her expression. Where'd you get this? I thought it was you, Lucky said instead of answering. I thought you were having an affair. I thought you were the one seeing William. I had no idea it was her. Where did you get this? Renee asked again. Did you hire someone? I saw his address in our Maps app and I was so worried. Lucky's arms were wrapped around his chest, as if he was holding himself together. I saw your car in his driveway and thought it was you. I thought you were leaving me. Lucky distantly realized he'd never been this honest with his wife before. William went to D.C. one night, he lied. I followed him to this hotel and thought you were there. But I couldn't find him. I was so sad, I stayed overnight. I couldn't come home. Oh, Lucky, Renee said. It wasn't me. Why would you think that? I think work is getting to me. It's been on my mind a lot. I feel like. Lucky paused, that sense of need growing in him like wildfire, the way he'd helplessly broken down in front of Chris Winters and his man, Marley, the desperate hope for help from Heather Anders. Sadness eating his soul. Renee looked small and miserable, sitting on the chair opposite him, knees pulled to her chest. I can't believe this is her, Renee said, and she glanced around the room, as if searching for a distraction. Looking at the walls, his desk, the floor, anywhere but at Lucky. As if she was mad at him, the way she would avoid his eyes and face during one of their rare fights. Her palms pressed into her forehead. How could Bill do this? Lucky sidled over next to her and pulled her to the floor, and she leaned into him and cried. For a few minutes, that's all that happened. Her tears and sobs and his arm heavily over her shoulders. Lucky wondered, as he always did during Renee's moments of sadness, if he was helping. There was something in Renee that seemed as if she didn't fully need him. Or she did, and he was only providing a basic level of comfort. Lucky wanted to be more for her. He wanted to offer her solace and intimacy, but he always felt as if there was some sort of emotional chasm, a part of her he could never reach. It's not your fault, Lucky said. Or my fault. It's his. When did you find out? About Mary Beth? Hours ago. We can figure this out, Renee said, as if she was only speaking to herself. This happens more than people realize. I mean, I was with an older man when I was younger. You were? The hurt in Lucky's voice surprised him. She nodded. When I was 16, he was 26. Or, at least he said he was. He might have been older. Renee had never told Lucky any of this. He was my first, she added. Lucky's own jealousy surprised him. He withdrew his hands from hers. I'm sorry, he said lamely. I think I'm sorry. Renee touched his knee, leaned forward and caressed his face. No words were said, but everything was understood. And that small moment of affection was one of the most intimate Lucky had ever felt. I know what Mary Beth's going through, Renee said. I know what it's like to think you're in love or be in love with someone older. I can talk about this with her, and then I'll let the school know. We can figure this out. I bet it's him she's been meeting up with, the older guy. Lucky imagined staying out here with Renee the entire night, coming up with different plans on a dry erase board, writing and wiping away terms like strangulation and gunshot and ice pick. It has to look like an accident, Renee would tell him, and Lucky would be impressed by her insight. You know, he'd reply shyly, I've actually done this before. Lucky? Lucky blinked. Yes? What are you doing? You're just sitting there smiling. Renee paused. I'm angry, but Mary Beth can't feel isolated from us right now. We need to tell her she can't see William, even if she won't understand why. She won't understand that being with a man so much older isn't a healthy relationship because he's not a healthy person. And this can affect her later in life. It can completely destroy her view of relationships and trust. Cold's coming, Renee said in his mind. So we pour water down William's driveway at night, let it freeze and turn icy. When he walks down the driveway, one of us pushes him down and the other speeds by and runs him over. Blammo. I've never heard you say blammo. I'm just trying so many new things. If you yell at Mary Beth and forbid her from seeing him, Renee continued, then you're putting our daughter down this path forever. She'll try and find what she lost in someone else, and it won't be someone her age. What about this? Imaginary Renee asked. We drug his food, sneak into his house, and put poison in his dinner. If he's eating sausage, Lucky would say, we'll poison it and walk in and tell him, as he's dying, William, you're the worst. Imaginary Renee laughed. Lucky, when did you get so funny? We can tell her we're mad, Renee said. Honestly, I don't think that's something we'll be able to hide. Neither of us are that good with keeping secrets. But we can't give her something to push back against. She's going to be looking for that, something that seems unfair, because, trust me, Mary Beth's going to want to justify it, and if she can justify it, then she'll keep doing it. We shoot him in the back of the head, Imaginary Renee suggested. Stab him in the stomach, slit his throat, hit him in the chest with a hammer until his ribs pierce his heart, tape up his mouth and pour water up his nostrils until he drowns. Lucky? Renee, honey, good news. I've done all this before. We need to do this together, Renee said. Mary Beth has to know we're on the same page, but instead of us angry with her, she has to realize we're worried about her. That'll get through. It won't be overnight, but it will happen. Okay. Renee pulled him toward her, and he lay down on the office's hard floor, his head in her soft lap, her hand stroking his hair. A lot of young girls have stories like this. That's the problem. And it's wrong. It's disgusting how these men take advantage of young girls. It was wrong what happened to me. Men need to be adults, and they need to be held accountable. William needs to be held accountable. I promise you, Lucky said grimly. He will be. Well, I mean, Jesus, Lucky, Renee replied as she absent-mindedly ran her fingers through his hair. Let's not kill him. Chapter 19. Ruby. Are you working with the Winterses? Eric Lou stared at Ruby, shocked to see her, one hand still on the front door that he had just opened. Jake's mom? He asked. Ruby didn't wait for an invite, pushed past him into his apartment. I saw one of their cars down the street. Ruby closed the door. Lexus with DC plates, tinted windows, the kind of car that would definitely get stolen in DC, except everyone knows not to touch it. So, let me ask you again. Are you working with the Winterses? Eric stayed by the front door as if unsure what to do. What happened to Jake? Eric asked. Is he okay? Ruby stared hard at him. So you did talk to them? Yes. Eric's voice dropped to a whisper. She hadn't seen Eric since he was a child, but he was the same reed-thin boy she remembered, shaggy brown hair that always looked unkempt and too big for his face. Strange how men only have 2 or 3 hairstyles through their entire lives. They made me. Made you, she said with derision. How? Eric lifted his shorts, showed her his thighs. The insides were dotted with reddish-black circles close to his groin. Cigarette burns. Don't tell Jake, Eric said. He'll feel terrible. And he looked down at the burns, his chin pressed into his chest like a little boy. Only those who seek the Lord, Ruby thought, understand justice. She glanced away from Eric, around the apartment. The layout was the same as she remembered from the last time she'd been here, years and years ago. Highland Towers, her first home after she'd left her mother. They shot Jake, Ruby said. He's with a doctor now. Jake was shot and you're not with him? His surprise was an accusation. I'm here, Ruby told Eric, because I need to know exactly what you said to the Winterses. Because that's why Jake got shot. Tears had swum up to Eric's eyes. Is he okay? Somehow Ruby hadn't expected to see this sadness. Love always surprised her. He's going to be. I told them Jake and Melissa were on Wharfside. Eric said softly. That's what Jake said when he called, after the diner. Who talked to you? Ruby asked, trying to refocus. Was it a big man, covered in scars? Yeah. 2 women, these twins came by the day earlier, then he showed up. The Rusu twins and then Seth. Ruby remembered the impact of the car slamming into Seth, the reverberation, his head smacking down on her hood and Seth stumbling back, collapsing. Lying so still, Ruby had thought he was dead until Seth started crawling toward her, one of his legs dragging uselessly, his face a mask being torn off. I didn't want anything to happen to him and Melissa, Eric said. Ruby still didn't want to look at Eric, so she turned her attention elsewhere, glanced at a framed picture next to the TV. Eric with his mother, his arms wrapped around her waist, his head only as high as her chest, beaming proudly. Tiffany. Ruby had been pressed by memories of Tiffany from the moment she'd slipped back into this apartment building. And she didn't want to think about her, desperately didn't. But Ruby couldn't stop herself from remembering. Ruby couldn't stop herself from crying. She was in the throes of exhaustion, Jake's constant wailing frustrating her. Jake's father, James, had taken a job working construction in Minnesota, ostensibly because the pay was too good to turn down, and he'd never returned. Ruby hadn't been entirely surprised. Her pregnancy had been unplanned, and she'd suspected that James wasn't as infatuated with her as she was with him. They'd been dating for half a year, but in secret. He only came over at night, a booty call joke they both laughed at, but privately to her seemed exactly what their relationship was. James never wanted to go out, content to order food and have it delivered, watch movies on her couch, stay at her place and never take her to his. He was embarrassed of her, Ruby gradually realized. But she liked James so much and spending time with him was so nice that she didn't care. She wondered if spending more time together would change how he felt about her. Sometimes she wondered what he saw in her. She wasn't thin, didn't have the delicate, cultivated features of other young women. Glowing skin, effortlessly tossed hair, a sensuous appeal to the curves of her lips and cheeks. Instead, Ruby had always been overweight, with big hair meant to distract from her face, a face full of round features, cheeks pressed into her mouth, small eyes. She'd never had a serious boyfriend, and she didn't want to call James one either. At least, not to his face. But she couldn't help thinking of him that way. He wasn't pleased by her sudden pregnancy. A week of unsettling stops by her apartment and, once, an angry visit to her job at the DMV. Loud accusations of her getting pregnant on purpose. Pushing her toward an abortion that she couldn't bring herself to do. His disbelief that this could have happened, even though James despised condoms and she'd never insisted. Urges for her to test herself over and over, sometimes while James watched, the humiliation of urinating in front of him while he glared. When he told her about the new job and his move across country, Ruby wasn't surprised. Or by then, disappointed. And so Ruby found herself alone and overwhelmed, living in this building, her small apartment filled with unwashed clothes and boxes of cheap diapers and small plastic bottles and containers with mismatched tops. James sent money for the first 2 months, but he never met his son, and the money soon stopped. Ruby was holding the framed photo of Eric with his mother, one of her thumbs absent-mindedly rubbing a smudge off the glass over Tiffany's face. She quickly placed the frame back. Eric was saying something. "You're not going to tell me where Jake is?" he asked desperately. "You won't take me there? I need to see him." "I can't," Ruby said. But she wasn't sure if he heard her. The situation had changed. She was no longer in control emotionally or morally. Sins carry more weight than wounds. She was at the breaking point, crying every day, lying in bed while 5-month-old Jake screamed in the living room when she heard someone walk into her apartment. "Hello?" a woman asked. Ruby dried her eyes. "Do you need help?" Ruby pulled herself out of bed, peered into the living room. A woman she didn't know but recognized stood in the doorway. Jake had stopped crying and was grabbing the bars of his crib and staring at the stranger. "I'm Tiffany," the woman said. "From down the hall? I heard crying." "Mine or his?" Tiffany smiled, but it hadn't been a joke. "May I?" she asked and pointed at Jake. "Okay." Tiffany held Jake and he quieted. A few whimpers, but the screams were gone. Tiffany had a child as well, a 1-year-old named Eric, which seemed to Ruby a wondrous distance from having an infant. The two women became instant friends, constants in each other's apartments. Both women were single mothers of only children. Both were under 30, Tiffany 25 and Ruby 23. Both had been left by the fathers of their children. Tiffany's family lived down south and was well off and sent her money, enough so Tiffany could be a full-time caregiver to her child while they begged her to return home. But they'd never accepted her boyfriend, Tiffany explained. Couldn't abide her having a child with someone Asian and had really only started talking with her after he left. Ruby could see her resentment, although she couldn't help but notice that Tiffany still accepted the money they sent. Not that she judged her for it. Ruby wished she had family. Except for Jake. She'd been completely alone since James had vanished. But with Tiffany, Ruby was able to manage stress without feeling overwhelmed, able to enjoy motherhood despite its complications. Able to do it without being alone. The two women made a habit of sharing a bottle of wine in the evening after the babies were in bed, sitting on one of their couches, watching some reality television show and trash-talking all the people on it. Even when they weren't together, they talked on the phone or texted, Ruby automatically smiling whenever a message from Tiffany appeared. Ruby got Tiffany a job at the DMV, and although the work was drudgery, standing at counter number 11 for 8 hours a day, helping angry people with their license issues, Tiffany was delighted, grateful for the opportunity to do something other than parent. And Ruby was excited to spend even more time with her friend. "I remember asking Mom why you two never talked, why Jake and I could play together and you never once saw each other. She said she was mad at you. She said you broke her heart." "It was mutual." Eric's eyes flashed. "So you're saying it was her fault?" "No." Ruby took a moment, forced herself to look away from Eric. She stared down into her hands. "How did Jake end up involved with the Winterses?" she asked. "It was a coincidence." "No such thing." "It was. He was taking photos and this woman started talking to him. She loved his work, told him she was looking for someone to take a picture of her for her husband. Her husband was connected, but Jake didn't know that." Eric rubbed the back of his neck. "Melissa saw the photos and contacted him." "He should have known better." "You mean like you should have known better when you got my mom involved?" That wasn't what had happened, but Ruby didn't correct him. "This is Gabe," Tiffany told her one day during lunch at the DMV. He was charming, and Ruby appreciated that he at least acted interested in meeting her, smiled warmly, gave her a quick hug that she wasn't expecting but didn't mind. He told Ruby that he worked in finance. He dressed nicely, a slim suit and a sizable watch glinting on his wrist, shiny shoes and belt. Tiffany was infatuated, touching his arm and laughing too much at his jokes, a constant smile on her face. "So, finance?" Ruby asked. "Like in a bank?" "Not exactly. I work for the Winters Corporation." How had it started? Ruby really didn't know. Couldn't remember exactly how she and Tiffany ended up printing fake IDs from their apartments for Gabe. Was it her or Tiffany who seemed to have the idea once Gabe brought it up one night, somewhere along the 3-month mark of his relationship with Tiffany? She remembered Gabe saying something about a struggling, undocumented family who needed papers or they were going to be deported. "You know," Gabe said casually, "you can get a lot of money by making fake IDs. I know someone who'd pay a lot, and it's not even that risky." Ruby and Tiffany looked at each other. "How much money?" Ruby asked. A night later, he showed up with 2 laminating machines, small printers, specialized paper, a pair of razors, and walked Ruby and Tiffany through the process. When people came to the DMV to renew their driver's licenses, they would keep the old ones. They'd bring those old IDs to their apartments and remove the security hologram with the razors. Then they'd fill out the new IDs with personal information and photos he'd provide, printed out on the thick stock and carefully sealed the old hologram to it. Run the fake ID through the laminator and let Gabe know when the batch was complete. "These are for good people," he said earnestly. Ruby didn't believe him, but she also didn't care. The day after she and Tiffany had each created 10 licenses, Gabe showed up at her door with a thick roll of $20 bills, and Ruby felt a deep excitement stir in her. It was the money, but it was more than that. It was her own lack of remorse. There was no difference to her about how the money had been obtained. It felt right for her to have it. The money mattered, and over the next few years mattered more than almost anything. Ruby had always lived just above her means, but without extravagance. Every last dime she made went into the essentials for her and Jake to survive. Rent, clothes, food, a sitter for the days she had to work late, and even then, she didn't have enough money to cover any other expenses. She had a pair of credit cards that were close to the max, and she knew any unexpected expense could push her permanently, irreparably, into poverty. But now, with the money Gabe gave her, Ruby finally made enough to pay a little on each of her credit cards, to buy better, healthier food at the grocery store, to make the repairs on her Toyota that had lingered for years, to buy her and Jake clothes from somewhere other than the consignment store. And all she had to do was make a few dozen fake driver's licenses every week. "She was a better person than you were. You ruined her." "Should we stop doing this?" Tiffany asked. "Why would we?" Ruby asked, honestly surprised. "I mean, I was talking to someone at work about this, and it's like a federal crime." "You were talking about this with someone?" Tiffany gestured with a bottle of water. Lately, she'd been drinking less wine. "I didn't tell them about us, but someone down in Florida got arrested for doing the same thing. They're going to prison." Ruby looked at her friend curiously. "Are you okay, Tiff?" Tiffany stared uneasily into her lap. "I don't feel great about doing this anymore, especially since that conversation. And we don't even need the money." "Are you serious? You told me you paid off your credit cards, started putting money in the bank. We got raises at work. You're fine." Ruby was silent for a moment. "What?" Tiffany prodded. "I don't think," Ruby said, choosing her words carefully, "we have the same deal with money." "What's that mean?" Ruby could hear Tiffany's emotions under her words, and she could sense the feelings stirring under her own. She took a sip of wine before she continued. Lately, she'd been drinking more wine. "We're different," Ruby said. "That's all. You have your family supporting you. I don't." Tiffany's cheeks pinked. "I need to work. I need a job." Ruby doubted that was true. "Okay, but Jake and I don't have anyone to turn to. I was going broke before Gabe told us about this." Something occurred to her. "Do you want to stop doing this just because you and Gabe aren't seeing each other anymore? Is that why?" Tiffany controlled her voice, but bristled. I told you, I don't care who Gabe's with now. I just don't see what the big deal is with stopping, or why you want me to keep breaking the law. If you want to keep doing this, you can do it alone. I don't care about being alone. It felt like a long time before either woman spoke again. I should go, Tiffany eventually said, and she stood. You were never there for anyone but yourself. I was there for Jake. Always, even after he left. He didn't think so. Ruby walked over to the front door, broken by the truth in Eric's words. It had been a mistake to come, to seek repentance without confession. A few weeks later, Tiffany was assigned to a different DMV in Fairfax. Ruby heard she'd requested it. They still lived doors away from each other, but Ruby took pains to avoid running into her. She knew Tiffany's routine intimately. When the other woman went to the store, when she dropped Eric off for daycare. Seeing Tiffany would break her heart. Even if Ruby resented her. Tiffany had made Ruby choose something terrible, either be lonely or impoverished. And neither of those were things Tiffany could understand. Still, sometimes, Ruby wanted to walk down the hall, knock on Tiffany's door, fall back into their old relationship. But if she did, Tiffany probably would have asked if she was still working with Gabe. And now, Ruby was working for the people Gabe had worked for. Gabe was gone, arrested and in prison somewhere. Ruby had found out when a man had come by her apartment that night, taken away the printer and lists of names. Asked her if she had any other materials relating to her work with the Winterses and, even after she told him no, ruthlessly searched her apartment. Jake staring as she stood by the door. "And why are you even here?" Eric asked, staring at her as she stood by the door. "Jake's hurt and you just abandoned him again? Shouldn't you be with him?" "That's enough," Ruby told him abruptly, thunder in her tone. "I let you vent, but that's enough. We're not talking about that." Ruby hadn't realized she was standing. Eric was taller than her, but at this moment, she towered over him. His hands were up, shielding his face. Had she struck him? Ruby couldn't remember. She just knew that she was shaking, breathing rasps. A knock on her door. Ruby opened it and Tiffany stormed inside. "They searched my apartment," Tiffany told her. "I haven't worked with them for months, and they come in and search my apartment." Ruby had imagined talking to Tiffany so often that she was surprised how hard it was for her to speak. Her lost friend stood before her, eyes blazing. "They had no right to do that," Tiffany went on. "Eric was there." "Gabe got arrested. They're making sure, if he talks, there's no evidence the cops can find. It's keeping us safe." "That's not what they're doing. They're covering their asses." "I don't know." Tiffany stopped fuming, seemed to gain a touch of control. She looked at Ruby, and Ruby almost cherished that moment, their eyes locked, the way they would when they shared something important about their past or laughed, or the excitement they felt when they first saw each other. But that moment ended when Tiffany asked, "How can you put Jake in this kind of danger?" "I'm doing this for Jake," Ruby said. "You're going to get him killed if you keep—" "You don't understand!" Ruby's voice had risen and she didn't care. "You don't get to tell me how my life is wrong and evil and I'm hurting my son when you have a rich family. You played with the Winterses, and you don't understand that there are people who can't just play. At any moment, you can go down south and have 3 meals and a bed, and I can't do that. I have to fight for it." Tiffany trembled as she spoke. "I am going back home," she said slowly, each word like a driven nail. "And you should leave before I do." "Why?" What does that mean? But Ruby knew what that meant. Tiffany was going to the cops. The next afternoon, a car rushed down the street as Tiffany was unlocking her driver's side door. Eric, sitting in the back seat. Ruby hadn't known what the Winterses were going to do, but she'd known they were going to do something. She heard the car's impact. Shouts. Ruby knelt and wept, and wondered why she was weeping. She'd done what was necessary. She'd kept Tiffany from getting her arrested, from separating Ruby from Jake. They'd hurt her and they'd helped her, these men. These men who created and shaped the world in which Ruby lived. A day later, a man showed up with money and a phone that he installed. Codes that he taught her. "You good?" he asked her before he left. Ruby opened the door but stopped before she stepped through. "I was wondering," she began and faltered, that thunder gone. "Before I go, can you tell me what Jake's like now?" Eric took a moment to answer. "He's a good man," he said. "Nothing like you." "Oh, Eric, there is no good or evil. Only the sword. My voice echoes through this winter wasteland, and with it I dispel shadows. There is the Lord, and He is God, and He is the devil, and He is us. And we are sin, and we are blessed, and so none are pure. I whisper my parables to the man with a sword, and he strikes down this world of sin, dragging his scythe through fields of dead wheat. I am the harbinger of death, and this world is a tomb of bones. And mine eyes have seen the true coming, the Lord standing on the edge of oceans, holding the bleeding spear that impaled his son. And on that day men will run, and men will weep, and men will devour each other. He will strike us all down, and all that remains will be all that ever was, the word and the sword." Chapter 20. Lucky. Confronting Mary Beth had gone, even in Lucky's most optimistic assessment, catastrophically wrong. It was obvious that it wasn't going to go well from the moment Mary Beth returned home from school to find Lucky and Renee waiting for her in the kitchen, presenting a united front. Lucky had started by showing her the video from the camera outside William's home. "You're spying on me?" Mary Beth asked, incredulous. "Yeah, I wouldn't have opened with that," Renee murmured. Lucky realized his mistake. This was a tactic he used when questioning people, presenting them with their guilt to throw them off balance for the remainder of the interrogation. That hadn't been the right approach with Mary Beth. "What the hell, Dad?" she'd asked and turned to Renee. "Did you know about this?" "We were worried about you," Renee said. "When your father thought you might be seeing William, he put a camera outside his house to make sure." "That's an invasion of privacy." "How?" Lucky asked. "You can't just stalk someone." "It's legal to install a camera or any sort of non-intrusive monitoring device outside of a residential property," Lucky explained, "provided that a reasonable sense of privacy isn't inhibited." "It's creepy that you know that," Mary Beth replied, and she turned to Renee. "Right, that's creepy." "A little," Renee admitted. "But that's not important. You can't keep seeing him." "Mom!" "I'm sorry." "William and I weren't even doing anything," Mary Beth fumed. "Just hanging out. We never even... He wanted to take it slow." "I don't believe that," Lucky said. "Oh, fuck off, Dad." Silence hit the room. "You can't talk to us like that," Renee said incredulously. Lucky could tell Mary Beth wanted to relent, but she couldn't let herself apologize. "But it's okay for Dad to spy on me? To put a camera outside someone's house?" Both Renee and Mary Beth looked toward him, waiting for his response. But Lucky didn't want to speak, didn't trust himself to say the right thing. He was offended, of course, but something else had been held in Mary Beth's retort that was even more distressing. It was the maturity in the insult, her push away, the loss of his child. "Dad!" Lucky left the kitchen, kept walking as Renee called, "Lucky!" headed out the front door. He hadn't been sure where he was going to go when he climbed into his Grand Cherokee. He just wanted to drive. Lucky kept the radio off as he drove out of Springfield, past Alexandria, past the National Harbor, each location jarring something from his memory. Springfield, where he'd driven Mary Beth to daycare every morning. Alexandria, where he and his daughter had walked around Mount Vernon one hot August afternoon when she'd had a week between summer camp and school, and he'd taken the day off from work to be with her. The National Harbor, where they'd ridden a giant Ferris wheel and he'd pointed out the monuments of D.C. He was in Maryland now, and Lucky always found it peculiar how Virginia and Maryland were so closely connected, yet so foreign to each other. The neighboring states had a natural rivalry, and Lucky had sold enough homes to longtime residents of Virginia to know that most of them would never consider living in Maryland. And he knew the same was true of Marylanders. But Lucky secretly liked a lot about Virginia's sibling state. He drove past exits for Annapolis and Baltimore and had fond memories of trips his family had taken, wandering around Baltimore's wondrous aquarium and touristy inner harbor, visiting Annapolis once for the 4th of July, Mary Beth's face gazing up at fireworks. The cities seemed to have greater demarcation than Northern Virginia's, separated by long forests and stretches of road until they finally appeared over a crest of highway, the glittering skylines. "That's where we're going," Mary Beth had declared, back when she was the age that merely being with him was exciting and fun for her. Lucky rounded the road past Baltimore's exit, and another memory tugged at him. Not of Mary Beth, but Seth, the young killer he'd apprenticed. The day he'd finished training Seth, had taught him the importance of subtlety and silence, instilled in him the way the Winterses wanted death to appear natural. And Seth had asked Lucky if he was going to partner with him. Lucky had given one final lesson. "I need a moment," he'd said, and he'd left the young man sitting in that Baltimore coffee shop, slipped out the door and driven off. Lucky already had a family. He drove past the high-priced neighborhoods of Chevy Chase and Bethesda, towns that bordered the District of D.C. and were considered some of the wealthiest in the nation. Recent news reports claimed that the Winterses had family who lived in these cities, but that hadn't cast a pall over the area. If anything, like controversy always does, it lent a mystique to the region, particularly since those cities tended to be closed off and reserved, constantly and carefully guarding their secrets. An hour and a half later, Lucky finished rounding the Beltway, pulled back into his driveway, pressed the garage door opener, drove his car inside and shut off the engine. Walked into the laundry room that, back when Mary Beth played soccer, had also been used as a mudroom. Every weekend the floor covered with her discarded dirty gear. A woman waited for him in the kitchen. "Hello, Lucky," she said. Lucky stood still, kept his face impassive despite his surprise. But his mind was working fast. The gun hidden in the attic, the other one in the backyard office. The knife rack behind her. Her empty hands clasped in front of her. Renee and Mary Beth. But he didn't move because he knew someone else was in the room. "Bianca," Lucky said. "She's not Bianca," the other woman behind him replied. Lucky could almost sense the gun in her hand. "I am." "Adriana," Lucky corrected himself. "All these years," Bianca Rousseau said, walking around him, joining her twin sister on the other side of the kitchen counter. "And you still get us confused," Adriana finished the sentence. Not like we spend a lot of time together, Lucky replied. Bianca stood next to her seated twin, her hand resting on the countertop. They each wore dark tops, thin hoodies, with their blonde hair pulled back into ponytails and pressed through the gaps in their black baseball caps. When did we meet you? Adriana mused. And was it just once? Bianca asked. It had to be. He's not very memorable. Lucky remembered exactly when he'd met the twins. It had been almost a decade ago, when they'd first started working for the Winterses, and Lucky had been sent to clean up the bloody mess they'd left behind. Adriana and Bianca Rusu had come from some Eastern European country. Bulgaria, Romania, Lucky could never remember. Pretending to be sex-trafficked teens, but they were actually working for the traffickers to keep the other women with them in line. Upon meeting Victor Winters, they'd decided to kill the men they were working for and take over the operation themselves. But their tactics were excessive, even for the Winterses, and they'd instead been given a job as enforcers and then assassins. Lucky had been called to a home in Annapolis, a large waterfront house with its own pool and a separate guest house. Very nice. And that's where he'd found the man the Rusu twins had murdered. But they hadn't just murdered him. He was icily dismembered, his limbs spread throughout the property, head placed on a lawn chair looking out over the bay, a leg standing on its own in the kitchen, an arm on the bathroom floor, the thumb poised in an ironic thumbs-up gesture. There was a dichotomy that struck Lucky as unpleasantly as a raspy alarm, refusing to quiet. When he'd been called to clean up the mess the Winterses had assumed the twins left behind, Lucky had expected to see a sloppy murder, puddles of blood, the kind of inexperienced killing done in rage. The casual ease of the assassination, the comfort with arranging such a grotesque display, brought a discomfiting sense to Lucky, something alien, occult. He wondered if his distress was because the killers were young women, since women were rare in this line of work. Most killers were men, as were most criminals. The notion that women had begun to descend to this base violence was, in some ways, distasteful to Lucky. Or perhaps he was bothered because the Winterses had assumed he could handle the crime scene, which Lucky had witnessed as he walked through the house, which meant he could understand it. He didn't like thinking about that. Lucky had met the twins on his last trip out of the house, lugging a plastic bag of towels and limbs, the sisters waiting by his car. He hadn't been surprised. For some reason, it was almost as if he'd expected them to show up. It was in Annapolis, Lucky said now. Your first job. It wasn't our first. You have a nice house. We loved the closets. And the finished basement. Lucky knew what they were implying, understood the threat. They'd gone through every inch of his house, were aware of his secrets. The Rusu twins were better at this than he was, Lucky grudgingly realized. They'd gotten the drop on him, kept him off balance, were probably weighing his death as they spoke. The rumor that infatuated most people about the killing of Victor Winters was the idea of a secret vigilante. Privately, Lucky had always wondered if that vigilante had been the Rusu twins, one or both of them, dressed in some disguise, perhaps acting on behalf of someone else. I've always wanted to ask you, Lucky said in an effort to distract them, but also genuinely curious. Do you know who murdered Victor Winters? For once, the twins were silent. Some people say it was a vigilante, he went on. And if it was, it would have to be someone good. Someone who knew how to break into a house belonging to a dangerous person and surprise him. Was it you? Adriana asked. Is that what you're saying? Bianca went on. Lucky was taken aback. I thought it was you, he said. Victor gave us our lives, Bianca replied. Adriana shook her head as she spoke. We'd never take his. It wasn't me, Lucky said. I don't like the idea of someone out there, Adriana said. Someone who I think. Someone better than us, her sister finished quietly. A disturbed silence, confidence shaken loose. Lucky didn't like thinking about that either. In your backyard office, Bianca said, and she cleared her throat. There's a loose board in the floor. She's right, Adriana replied. The twins were letting him know they'd gone through his backyard office, searched his entire house, found his weapons, reasserting themselves. This house has all sorts of spots that need to be touched up, Lucky replied, hinting he had more weapons. He hoped they couldn't tell he was exaggerating. The truth is, Adriana said, we don't want to stay long. All we really need, from Bianca, is an address. Whose? Lucky asked, although he knew exactly what they wanted. He tried to keep his face blank, unexpressive, despite his worry that he had no weapon nearby. And despite how their shared cadence, like two smiling demons strumming a single harp, plucked his nerves. Your old friend, Ruby Smith. We found out Jake is her son. Lucky nodded. A lot of people looking for Ruby right now. I'm one of them. Bianca's hand shifted behind the counter. We'd like to find her first, Adriana said. You heard about Seth? Bianca asked her sister. He's in the hospital. Not expected to recover any time soon. That means there's one less person looking. One less chance of someone taking our reward. Less is good. The way they passed words back and forth was mesmerizing, drawing him in, sirens luring Lucky's ship toward submerged stones. Somehow he had to change course. If Jake and Melissa are with Ruby, then Ruby could take them and disappear, Lucky said. She already left the Winterses once. She could do it again. True. So, Lucky went on, the only other hope is that she reaches out to an old friend. And I was one of the oldest friends she had. You need me. The twins glanced at each other. Do we? I don't think we do. Ruby's probably going to contact me, Lucky bluffed. When she does, I'll tell you. Why would you do that? I don't think he would. We could just torture him. We could torture his family. And, in an extraordinary moment of bad timing, that's when Lucky heard the garage door open. The sound of the garage door rising echoed through the kitchen. The Rusu twins watched Lucky calmly, something close to a smile tugging each of their lips. Looks like we're going to meet the wife, Bianca said. How do I look? Beautiful. Me? Gorgeous. Weird, Lucky observed. But you need to leave, both of you. Do we? I want to say hi. He took a step toward them and Bianca's hand rose. She held a gun. The door leading from the garage opened. I'll tell you when Ruby contacts me. He tried to make sure the desperation he felt didn't creep into his voice. I promise. Lucky? Renee behind him. He turned toward his wife, blocking Bianca's hands from Renee's view with his body. Hey! Renee curiously peered past him at the two women. Is Mary Beth here? I thought she was with you. After you left, Renee looked to the twins again. This time, Lucky followed her gaze. The gun was gone. Hello? Renee asked. Lucky's selling our mother's home, Adriana said. She died earlier this year, Bianca added. Oh, I'm sorry. Lucky heard the apprehension in his wife's voice.
We thought we'd have more time with her,
Adriana said.
but when it happens faster than you expect. 1 second she was there, the next second, gone. We didn't even get to say goodbye.
I'm sorry? Renee offered again. A moment passed.
We'll be in touch, Lucky,
Adriana said. Lucky walked the twins to the door. He kept his eyes focused on them until they drove away. He tried to think of his next move, of what the Russo twins were going to do and how he could get ahead of them. He knew the twins were going to try and find Ruby, and, failing that, they would return. But they wouldn't go after Lucky. Easier to break him if they went after someone else. Lucky glanced into the living room, at the end table where their family pictures had been moved to make room for the Christmas decorations. Mary Beth's picture, his daughter in her high school soccer uniform, smiling with one knee balanced on a ball, was gone. Lucky returned to the kitchen.
Where's Mary Beth?
He asked. She left right after you did. Renee was staring down at her phone. I told her she'd better not see William, but she probably went right there. Also, those women were weird.
We need to find her.
I know.
Renee, we need to find her now.
Renee looked up from her phone, puzzled. Why? Lucky paused, like a foot poised before stepping onto some new, uncertain land.
Because the women who were here are going to kill her.
Chapter 21. Melissa. It's me, Melissa said. She didn't expect Chris to respond right away, and he didn't. Melissa pictured him holding the phone away from his face, scowling at the unfamiliar number. She waited through the silence, the phone pressed tight against her ear. Calling him wasn't something she'd done lightly. Melissa knew it was likely that there was no reasoning with Chris anymore. But she was out of options, and her only hope left was that there was still some chance for a connection between the two of them. He'd never hurt her, and, as far as Melissa knew, never cheated on her. Everything about Chris had grown corrupt except seemingly their relationship.
Is Jake dead yet?
Chris asked. No, she realized. There is no chance.
I heard Seth shot your boyfriend,
Chris went on.
Wish I'd been there to see it.
She knew what Chris was doing, heard the pain in his voice, the pain he wanted to drag her into. And even though she knew what he was doing, it worked.
Jake's going to live,
Melissa said, her voice hot.
Should have been you. A bullet right in your face.
Melissa had never felt hate like she did at this moment. But she knew she had to control her anger, push it down, refuse to let rage get the best of her. This was a sharper pain than she would have expected. Injured love, the way you can never shake yourself entirely free from someone you once cared for. Let us go, she said. A bark of laughter. You know what happened at the diner, Melissa went on. Innocent people died, and your guy ended up arrested. It's better for everyone if you just let us go.
Chris will burn down the world to find you,
Chris said. Christ, he's still doing that third-person thing, Melissa thought. But something about Chris seemed different. It took Melissa a moment to realize what it was. This was how he acted when other men were around. She had to get him alone. Melissa tried to control her anger, tried to stop this fury from devouring her further. Searched for a way to convince Chris to change his mind, to find something in their relationship. Old feelings, innocent memories, heartful love, something to which he clung. Chris, Melissa said. Please. A moment of silence, and then he offered an abrupt,
Hold on.
she heard rustling. He was walking away from the men. She wondered where he was, if Chris was in their house, heading down the hall to their bedroom, or walking into the small backyard, the high fence, the bushes of roses she'd planted. They were likely in their final bloom of the year, curled and blackened red. She stared out the kitchen window at Dr. Steve's yard, uncared for and overrun by weeds. Melissa wondered if Dr. Steve spent time in the yard, or if it was something he'd inherited when he'd moved in. Sometimes Melissa imagined herself working in a nursery, delicately planting seeds that would bloom into lovely flowers. Lilies with their long petals, stark whites and dramatic reds, straining pistils, tender tall yellow daffodils, bashful toward the sun, their long necks bent. Cups of tulips, insistently firm, their heads tightly wound together, as if they only released on their own terms, keeping their beauty to themselves. It was like the brief fantasy she'd entertained in Wharfside of a quiet country life dominated by routine, the simplicity of happiness. Back. The little word was a sharp reminder of Chris, how he always returned to a call or text with a quick back. Chris sounded different now, and Melissa knew it was because he was alone. She was certain that ever since she'd left, Chris had spent all his time in the company of men. He hated being alone, which, at first, she'd found sweet, his desire to be with her. It wasn't possessive or overbearing, just an eagerness to share experiences, the way new relationships happily occupy the entirety of each partner's time. But Melissa noticed, after months had passed, that there was something desperate to it. Once she took a trip to Florida to visit a cousin from Panama who had moved to Orlando, stayed for a week to help her get settled and adjusted to American life. Chris was miserable during the week, calling Melissa constantly, sometimes just sitting on the phone in silence. Especially when he detected her joy. The way she and her cousin couldn't stop laughing, how her cousin spoke in rapid Spanish and Melissa was getting better at replying. She'd wondered if his behavior had been motivated by some aggrieved sense of ownership or jealousy, or if Chris was just a deeply lonely man. "You're not going to let us go, are you?" "No." "I'm sorry," she told him. "I'm sorry about everything happening the way it did, but I don't want anyone to get hurt anymore." Chris made a weird sound, a mix of a laugh, surprise, and the sarcasm of a snort. "Sure, no one should get hurt." "I'm serious." "You have to be hiding out somewhere," Chris said, pondering out loud. "Seth said he put a bullet right in him just before Ruby hit him with her car. You're not in a hospital, so where are you?" His thought process made Melissa uneasy, worried he'd actually be able to reason out where they were hiding. She tried another tactic. "I'm really sorry for leaving the way I did. It's just that last year, we were so different and apart. I thought you could tell. I thought you were happy." "Happy? I was terrified. You'd changed so much." "You're the one who changed. Left me for some photographer." You broke my heart," Chris was whispering, either because he was trying to control his emotions or because he didn't want to be overheard. "Was Jake the first? Were there others?" "There was never anyone else." The words sounded as if she had never loved anyone but Jake. Melissa didn't know what to say to correct that and wasn't sure if she should. "What does he—" Chris stopped speaking, his voice tight when he resumed. "What do you like about him?" "I don't want to talk about him. I want to talk about us." The latter sentence felt too intimate, as if there was still an us to return to. "Maybe we were apart this last year," Chris went on as if he hadn't heard her. "Maybe I was becoming someone you weren't sure about. Maybe you were scared. I get that." She waited for him to continue. But I was scared, too. Why do you think I stayed away from my family back when we were first together? Why do you think it took me so long to join up with them? I know. I needed you. Knowing you were there for me, knowing I had you in my life. My family was one side, but it couldn't be my only side. Do you understand that? I needed you, Mel. That part's still there, Melissa said. She stared at Dr. Steve's dead garden outside under the sinking sun. His home was so isolated. Only one other house on the road, far in the distance, unseeable through the trees. I was so lonely back then, except for you. Chris's voice was filling with reproach. And I knew there was distance between us. I knew we needed to circle back, and I wanted to. But then he was in my house. He was with you. I'm sorry. And now you call Chris and ask him to forgive you? Melissa looked at the dead garden. There's no saving you, Chris told her. She hung up, a hand on her shoulder. Melissa turned, too shocked to make a sound, half expecting to see Chris behind her. But it was Eric, a messenger bag slung over his shoulder. Ruby was behind him, standing in the kitchen doorway. How's Jake? Eric asked, his voice breaking. Melissa saw his tears, felt them against her shoulder as she held him, as Eric apologized for what had happened to Jake and her, desperately apologized. Melissa held him and gazed at Ruby, trying to decipher the stoic, stony expression on the other woman's face. It was like peering into deep shadows and wondering what was about to emerge. Chapter 22. Lucky. What do you mean? Renee asked Lucky. Those women are going to kill Mary Beth. Lucky and his wife stared at each other. Follow me. Lucky briskly walked out of the kitchen. Lucky? Renee asked, but she followed him. Lucky had 1,000 thoughts swirling through his mind, like a pile of wind-blown leaves, but there was one he couldn't escape. This was the end. Everything was over. Every secret would be spilled, every element of his life changed. Everything he'd struggled to maintain would shatter. But he felt happy. Euphoric, even. In a way, Lucky said as he and Renee hurried up the stairs from the living room and toward their bedroom. This is a good thing. I'm sorry, what? The Russo twins had left the hatch to the attic open. The retractable stairway unfolded. Lucky knew why. They wanted to complicate matters, hoped Renee would see the open stairs, discover his secrets. And that was fine. It was time. He felt a wonderful sense of relief at the thought of unburdening himself. Lucky was reminded of a conversation years ago with a neighbor who had been recently laid off from his long-time job, and that man's strange sense of peace when he'd shared this news with Lucky and Renee. They'd assumed, discussing it later, that he'd been deep in denial. But no, Lucky thought now. It was relief. Leaving a bad situation is always a good thing, regardless of the next uncertain step. He climbed the ladder. Renee, Lucky began decisively, I haven't felt right for a while. I was doing fine for so many years. It was like I had one secret part of my life, and you and Mary Beth were another, and I kept them separate, far away from each other. And that felt like the right thing to do. He could see the removed patch in the insulation that the Russo twins had yanked away, his duffel bag inside. Lucky pulled out the bag. Of course, they'd taken his weapons. The Glock 22 was gone, as were the knife and mace. All that remained were bullets. He placed the square of insulation back into the wall, walked to the other side of the attic. Kept us separate from what? Renee asked from below. Is this about William? Was one of those women married to him? Why are you in our attic? Lucky pulled his keychain from his pocket, unfolded the tiny Swiss Army knife blade attached to it, plunged it into the insulation and cut it open. Pulled out a second duffel bag. Unzipped it. The Henry AR-7 rifle wasn't Lucky's ideal choice, but he was out of options. His only other hiding spot was in the outdoor office, and the Rusu twins had already gone through it. He used to keep an emergency bag of weapons hidden in the garage, but once Mary Beth had learned to drive, he didn't trust that she wouldn't stumble upon it. "This isn't about William," he said. "It's someone else." "Who?" The good thing about the AR-7 was that the rifle was small, lightweight, and easily assembled. It only took Lucky about a minute, kneeling on the floor, opening the stock pad to pull out the receiver, barrel, and magazines. He quickly inserted the receiver into the stock, screwed it in place, threaded the barrel to the action, tightened it, and replaced the stock pad. Pushed in a magazine. Racked the bolt back. Renee had climbed up the steps and was staring at him. "Why do you have that gun?" "It's a rifle," Lucky said and hooked a strap to it. "Then why do you have that rifle?" "We need to call Mary Beth," Lucky said. "She needs to come meet us." Panic overcame Renee's words. "Why do you have that rifle?" Lucky slung the AR-7 over his shoulder, lifted his pants leg and wrapped a sheath around his calf. Pulled out a steel black Tanto knife from the duffel and slid it inside. "Let's go," Lucky said. Renee climbed down the attic stairway, clumsily, losing her grip and catching herself. Lucky jumped down after her, didn't bother with the ladder. He didn't land as smoothly as he'd hoped, stumbling on the floor, knees aching. Renee was hurrying out of the closet. He caught her arm, turned her toward him. "I told them I want to walk away," he said insistently, and it felt so right, Renee, and they agreed. Even after all the years I've worked for them, they were just going to let me walk away after this job. But I'd have to give up an old friend of mine, and I don't want to do that to her. I don't want to lie anymore. Let me go. If I let you go, you'll run away, and they'll find you and Mary Beth and kill you both." "Who?" Renee stopped, struggling. "The Winterses." "As in Victor Winters? Those people who were in the news?" Lucky loosened his grip on her arm. And he noted that the more information he gave Renee, the less inclined she seemed to run. "Grab some clothes," he said. "Take some for you and Mary Beth. Enough for a week. You have 10 minutes and I'll explain everything." Lucky heard her frantically rummaging upstairs as he walked into the living room. His Limax Christmas villages were sprawled out on the fireplace hearth and the living room table, and Lucky knelt between them. He tried not to have a favorite, but Lucky loved the village on the hearth. It had been built on 3 long tiers, each covered with blankets of fake snow, hiding the wires underneath. There was another reason he was always fixated on this village. One of the pieces didn't belong to it. This misplaced figurine was similar to the others, plastic and about 2 inches tall, but it lacked the reddish cheeks, the stocking cap and scarf, the depicted cheer from assembling a snowman or tugging a sled. This piece had a grim countenance and a cape, and Lucky always kept it carefully hidden in the village so that it wouldn't disrupt the tableau. He'd had this tiny superhero since he was a child, and Lucky had no idea what its name was or anything about it. His father had given it to him, and Lucky suspected it was a knockoff. But he'd kept this toy with him ever since, deep in his pocket or backpack during his school years, in his car's glove compartment after graduation, even tucked in the breast pocket of his rented tuxedo the day of his wedding. Lucky debated taking this nameless superhero with him now. But no. This was where he belonged. 20 minutes later, he and Renee were driving out of their neighborhood, the afternoon sun dropping like a coin into a piggy bank when he spoke again. "So there's obviously a part of me I've never told you about," Lucky said, his eyes everywhere on the road, scanning the cars parked on the side of the street, glancing back into the rearview mirror. "And it's never been a problem before." Something caught his eye. "Did you know the Petersons are selling?" he asked, pointing to a colonial with a realtor sign in the front yard. "You were selling houses for the Winterses?" Renee guessed. "No." She waited. "I found people they wanted me to find." "What?" Lucky said nothing. "And then what?" Lucky still didn't reply. "But these are bad people, right?" Renee asked in his mind. "These are people who deserve it? I know this was a secret you kept from me, but I guess it was for the best. And I know we're in danger, but Mary Beth and I will do whatever you say to keep us safe. Thank you, Lucky." Lucky shook his head. Renee was screaming and her door was open and her right foot was outside and bouncing on the pavement. "Wait!" Lucky shouted, and he swung the car to the side of the road. Renee unfastened her seatbelt and ran into the golf course bordering their neighborhood. Lucky grabbed the rifle from the back seat and ran after her.
This is the end of disc number 5. Please insert disc number 6. This is disc number 6.
Renee was faster than he expected, although Lucky knew her speed was motivated by fear. He'd chased people down before, and once their adrenaline left, once they'd fled a short distance, they dramatically slowed. Even trained runners found their energy emptied by fear, bent over, hands on their knees, saying variations of, "Please, please, just hold on," as Lucky approached. Renee stopped at the edge of a man-made lake, now nearly black this late in the day, as if she was debating jumping in. "Renee, that water's filthy." She turned toward him. Lucky had never seen her eyes so wild. "This is a joke," Renee said. "This is a joke and you don't mean any of it." Lucky didn't approach her, didn't respond. She was staring at the rifle. Lucky lifted off the strap and set the weapon on the grass. Renee took a step backward. "Careful," Lucky warned her. "The lake's behind you." How weird it would be, he thought, if Renee accidentally fell in. What an odd moment that would be in this surreal evening. Lucky imagined them discussing it years from now, laughing on the porch of a cabin. "I fell right in," Renee would exclaim, and Lucky would tease her and they'd laugh at her silliness. "This isn't true, is it?" Renee asked. He didn't respond. My God. Renee sat abruptly on the grass, her legs sticking out before her like roots that had been yanked from the ground. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Lucky said. "All you have to do is believe me." "Why are they after you?" "Like I said, those women think I have information about someone they're looking for." "And do you?" Lucky considered it. "Yes." "So why not tell them if you're putting us in danger? Why not just tell them?" "Because they'll kill us if they don't need me, and because I can't do that to her." "Her?" Lucky detected the different note in Renee's voice, the one-word question that was on the verge of something deeper, like the tip of a spear protruding from a cave. And a part of him marveled that, even with what he was telling Renee and everything she was learning about him, his faithfulness to her still, in some way, mattered. "I met her when I started working for them, and I helped her when she left, because no one escapes when— I'm sorry, that's such a terrible slogan. She was a friend. Nothing more. I've never cheated on you." "I don't care about that right now," Renee said. "I know where she is, and she probably knows how to find who they're looking for. When I came home today and found those two women in our house—" "Those women broke into our house?" "Then I knew I was out of time. Once the Winterses know I can find her, they're going to come after me. And not just me. You and Mary Beth, too." Renee looked out over the darkening lake, but she didn't turn her face away completely, as if she had to keep watching him. "I never wanted to hurt you," Lucky told her quietly. "I just wanted to lie to you." "Ma'am,
Are you okay?
A stranger's voice. A man's voice. It came from somewhere behind him. Lucky guessed maybe 20 feet or so. The rifle was lying on the grass in front of him. The Henry AR-7 wasn't a very powerful rifle. It was mainly used for hunting small animals. Lucky kept it sentimentally. It had been one of the first weapons he'd trained on, shooting squirrels and sparrows in his backyard as a teen while his parents drank in the kitchen. If Renee called out for help, if she suddenly let the panic edging into her face overcome her, then he'd have to turn and run down this man and use a knife strapped to his ankle. Lucky hoped the stranger didn't have a weapon of his own. But he probably did. This was the exact situation men craved. A woman in need of protection. A seemingly threatening assailant, and the advantage of starting a fight, so men have the time to summon their courage. But Lucky knew what truly awaited this unseen person standing behind him. Because sometimes a man opened a door and didn't realize what waited on the other side. Lucky waited for Renee to respond to the stranger, to open that door. Chapter 23. Jake. "Hey, Jake," Eric said. "Do you mind moving? I want to play pool." There was a dryness to Jake's voice he hadn't expected when he laughed, the sound hoarse, scabbed. And the throbbing in his shoulder increased, threatened to break beyond his control. The pain was already close to something worse, like a sword was lodged in his shoulder, and too much movement would drive the blade through. "I'm lying on a pool table?" he asked weakly. Melissa leaned down, holding back her hair in a gesture Jake found comforting, and gently kissed him. "There's a huge board covering it," she told him. "But it still looks more comfortable than that mattress you had." "I kept having these dreams," Jake said. "I couldn't wake up. I was here in this room, and I could hear people talking, but I couldn't wake up." "Jake," Eric said softly, "that sounds like the most boring dream." "Yeah, I've had better." "How do you feel now?" Melissa asked. "Tired." "I think Dr. Steve gave you a lot of meds," Melissa told Jake. "Since he doesn't have anesthesia, he went to get more." "What am I on?" Eric and Melissa looked at each other. "Morphine?" Melissa guessed. "Helium?" "We don't know drugs." "Is my camera okay?" No jokes now, Jake noticed. Just solemnity from Melissa and Eric. And something about their staid response saddened him. Guilt rose so strong that the pain in his shoulder intensified. Guilt that he'd demanded anything from the people he loved, including their devotion to his art. "The bullet didn't hit it," Melissa said. "Just you," Eric added, and that offhand humor he'd been trying to keep, that detachment, slipped. He blinked fast, touched his eyes. "I'm glad you're here," Jake told him. Eric looked like he wanted to say more, but stopped himself. "How'd you find us?" Jake asked. "I followed Ruby." Jake's arm jerked, and pain and worry flooded him. "Ruby's here?" He tried to rise, but the injury to his shoulder and Melissa's hand on his wrist kept him in place. "She came to see me," Eric said uncomfortably, "to ask about the Winterses. I told her what I told Melissa upstairs. That they made me talk, made me tell them about Warside. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Jake didn't care about that. "Is Ruby here now?" "She was," Melissa said. "I think she stepped out." "We need to go. You can't trust her." Melissa's hand hadn't left him. "She saved our lives." "We are leaving," Eric told him. "Tomorrow, we're going to head south or west, find a small town with a tiny hospital, get you patched up, and then figure out the best way to disappear from the Winterers." "I think it's Winterses," Melissa said.
I don't trust Ruby, Jake said flatly. I don't. We need to go now. Eric and Melissa stayed silent. The harshness of his words hung in the air. Well, we can't leave right now, Melissa told him. Dr. Steve said he needs to take out the bullet. It's still in you. He's going to do it later today. He is? She nodded. That's why he's getting more drugs. Jake shifted, grimaced. Watch Ruby until then, he urged. Closely, please. We will, Melissa said, and her eyes met his. Jake couldn't look at Eric. He was too worried his expression might somehow reveal everything he knew, the truth he'd kept from his friend for years. The next time Jake woke, the pain was deeper, jagged, and Ruby was with him. Where's Melissa? Jake asked, alarmed. He struggled to sit up, but his shoulder hurt too much to allow him even that freedom. And Eric? They're upstairs. Ruby was perched on the stool Melissa had been sitting on, peering at him curiously. Why are you here? Jake's voice still held a rasp, but he didn't mind it now. It felt like spewing poison. Steve told me to come down. He said I should talk to you first. I'll be fine. You may not, Jake, Ruby told him, and now he noticed the redness in her eyes, the tightness around her mouth. The bullet's close to an artery. Steve's worried. Her words were like another weight on his chest, forcing him to stay in his place, and Jake hated this trapped feeling, impotency and agony that left him helpless on the table. But Steve's a good doctor, Ruby went on, as if she was trying to reassure both of them. That's what Victor always said. I don't really care about Victor Winters' Yelp reviews. Ruby smiled at that, and Jake suddenly remembered how he could sometimes make her smile. You should cut your hair. Ruby touched it, fingered a curl. It's getting too long. He flinched, and that imaginary blade in his shoulder cut deep. It took him a moment to say, Don't touch me, Ruby. She looked like she wanted to touch him again, but instead she brought her hand back to her lap. They told you what I did? Saved you from Seth? There was something different in her tone now, far from what he remembered. Are you still drinking? I am not. So you waited till I left. When you left, Ruby said slowly, that's when I knew I had to stop. I'd lost too much. I can't trust anything you tell me. I know why you're afraid. Ruby's voice dropped a tone. You're worried I'll tell Eric what I did, and he'll find out you knew. All this time. Jake didn't respond. I wouldn't do that to you. I had a dream, Jake said as a way of testing her. A lot of dreams. And in one of them I heard you shouting. Was that real? It was, Ruby assented. I was calling Melissa a whore. She's not a whore. All people are sinners, Jake. Are you still working for them? Jake studied her closely, his gaze searching her face like a metal detector scanning the ground. Her eyes met his. I stopped years ago. Their stares held until Jake and Ruby simultaneously let out small sighs and turned away. Jake was irritated that he'd had the same reaction as Ruby, even more annoyed that it seemed to make her happy. What? He asked huffily. Ruby quickly, gently ran her fingertips over his face. You're still my boy, she told him. And then she left. Jake watched her trudge up the stairs like a heavy axe slowly being lifted. Chapter 24. Lucky. Lucky felt good. No, he felt wonderful. A burden was swept off his shoulders, and he hadn't realized its full weight. Renee sat in the passenger seat,
stoically staring forward. She'd held her tongue on the golf course. "I'm fine," she'd called back to the concerned man watching them. "We're just talking. He's my husband." And Lucky had known with those 3 short sentences that there was a way forward for their relationship. "How long has it been?" Renee suddenly asked. This was the first thing she'd said since they'd gotten back into the car, the hour-long drive from their neighborhood to the town of Front Royal. "Since I've been working with them? Too long." "Were we ever in danger?" she asked. "Mary Beth and me." "No," Lucky lied firmly. "Not until now. Not until the Rusu twins realized they need information I have." "But you've hurt people," Renee said. There was a tremor in her voice, as if she was close to tears. Lucky wanted to pull over and talk with her, but didn't want to risk her running off again. "I did, but I'm done with that," Lucky told her earnestly. "I'll never do it again." A quiet, "Okay." This moment felt like a fresh start. "I can get all this straightened out," he assured her. "I'll fix it and leave the Winterses. We can get back to normal." Renee didn't respond. They drove on in relative silence. Lucky tried to talk with her about Mary Beth's outburst, the anger he'd felt toward William McKenna, hoping to find ground on which they could commiserate. But Renee barely responded aside from an occasional murmur. Lucky decided to stop talking and enjoy the drive. The sprawling suburbs of Northern Virginia were left behind, and blue-gray mountains appeared in the distance, like rumpled bedcovers. They drove into Front Royal, the small town at the base of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a mix of homes and stores fashioned from homes and ramshackle small buildings made up of weathered boards. The roads narrowed and curved, and Lucky had the same sensation he'd had last time he'd driven here years ago. The feeling that he was approaching the mountains without realizing he was already in them. They were close to the cabin when Lucky realized Renee was crying, and he pulled the Jeep over and tried to comfort her with an embrace. But Renee pushed away from him and screamed. Lucky lifted his hands, settled back into his seat. Okay, he said and restarted the engine. "Not ready for a hug, I get it." But that was the only outburst, which Lucky considered a win. He had never known what would happen if Renee learned the truth of his other life, but he'd assumed it would take weeks, months, maybe years of work to repair their marriage. 2 outbursts in an hour, both of which she'd calmed down from, were far better than he'd expected. Lucky parked the car, hurried around to her door to open it, a chivalry he regretted not practicing more. "You'll be safe here," Lucky told her. Renee stood behind him next to the cabin's door, looking around at the dusty furniture illuminated by faint sunlight through smudged windows. The cabin was small, nothing more than a rectangular living room, an adjoining room for a bedroom, another for a bath. "One of my clients had this place, and his daughter inherited it after he died. But the daughter is married and living in Europe, and she and her family never come here." "Did you kill the owners and take it?" "What?" She just looked at him. "No!" Renee made a non-committal sound, moved away, touched the top of a couch. "It's only a little dirty," Lucky assured her, "but you only need to stay here for a night or 2. I texted Mary Beth and she's on her way. I'm going to fix everything. You'll see." Renee nodded. "When Mary Beth comes, you can take the car to town to get food, but I wouldn't spend too much time in public. Don't use any credit cards and delete all the apps with location tracking in your phones. Social media, family trackers, all of it. This area is pretty empty this time of year, but you two still shouldn't be seen. If you do go into town and you think you're being followed, make sure Mary Beth is safe and try to lead the pursuer away. Do you want my gun? No? Okay, no gun. But once you lead the pursuer away, make a scene. Scream or yell. That will likely drive whoever it is off, but don't stay around until the police arrive.
Remember that the police work for them. Not all the cops, but enough. If you're here with Mary Beth and you see someone approaching the cabin, make sure the doors and windows are locked. They'll break through the window, but there are knives in the kitchen. Stand by the side of the window and, when they're trying to come in, use the knives to keep them out. If they do climb in, slash them and run for the door. Remember, you want to slash, not stab. It's too easy for a knife to get lodged in muscle or bone. Slashing has a better chance of severing an artery. Keep the lights off at night, the noise low in daytime, and the curtains always closed. Don't watch television together because one of you needs to hear what's happening outside. At night, don't look directly at a light because it's hard to see if you need to quickly look away. Always move quickly, inside and outside. Given the choice, a good assassin will wait for a target to be still, and the Rusu twins are good assassins. And remember, they're not going to want to kill you because they want to find me. But don't ever assume they'll let you live. How do you know all this? Because it's what someone should do if I was after them. Lucky wasn't sure what else he should say after that. He nodded and started out the door. Be careful, Renee said faintly. And those 2 words were enough to reassure Lucky that Renee was still there for him. He patted the AR-7 on the passenger seat, content in a way he hadn't been for years, as Lucky drove off to find Ruby. To end this part of his life. Chapter 25. Melissa. Jake was sweating so much it worried Melissa, a wet sheen like wax over his sleeping face. There was a damp odor to his clothes, Jake's scent that Melissa faintly remembered from his pillows and sheets, but now that scent was sickly, gaseous, and medicinal. She could smell it distinctly when she replaced the blood-reddened bandage on his shoulder from where Dr. Steve had removed the bullet. Eric's voice was coarse when he spoke. Ruby told me she had Dr. Steve put Jake under for a lot longer. He'll be out tonight, maybe even till tomorrow. Dr. Steve said the pain would be severe and Ruby didn't want to see him hurting. I'm just glad he'll be okay, Melissa said. During the procedure, as she and Eric had waited upstairs, her anxiety had felt like rabid dogs nipping at her heels. So much so that, even in relief, her exhausted body ached. Eric leaned back on the stool, looked over his shoulder at the stairs leading up from the basement. I don't trust her. Jake doesn't either. He never told me why, and I just thought it was because she was this terrible mother. But when she came to my place earlier, I felt like there was something else. He gazed at Melissa from under the hair dropping over his eyes. What about you? Well, she keeps calling me a whore, so that's not great. She blames you for Jake getting shot. Eric's words were somewhere between a statement and a question. She's got a point. How? He almost died because of me, Melissa said, her voice small. And he keeps getting beat up. I'm sort of thinking maybe I'm not the right girl for him. Eric smiled at that, and he looked down warmly at Jake's bruised, sleeping face. He can sure take a beating though, right? One time this guy called me a not very nice name for an Asian. I was going to ignore it, but Jake went over to the guy and told him to apologize. Of course, the guy wouldn't, so then Jake took his picture, and then the guy threatened to kick his ass, but Jake just wouldn't back down. What happened? Oh, the guy knocked him out with one punch. Jake can't fight, not even when his life depends on it, but he does stand up for his people. He really does. Melissa picked up Jake's hand, held it, rubbed his thumb with hers. How did you follow Ruby here? The Winterers have been watching my place, but only the building's front door. I knew Ruby would leave through the back, so I did the same. Drove right behind her. I mean, she pulled over after like a mile, and I told her I wanted to see Jake. She didn't want me to come, but I think she felt like she owed me. Why? She introduced my mom to the Winterers, got her involved with them. I didn't know that. Jake didn't tell you? No. Eric cleared his throat. People make their choices, right?
When I remember my mom, I remember this young woman who was always holding me, always smiling. And I know there's more to her. I know she wasn't just that person. The same way I know there's more to Ruby. It's just hard for me to accept that. I think Jake was right, he went on. We can't trust her, and if I need to, I'll kill her. Eric picked up the messenger bag by his feet, opened it, showed Melissa a gun inside. I don't think Jake would ever forgive you, Melissa told him as Eric closed the bag. I know what he says about her, but she's still his mother. He won't understand. Killing her is protecting him. I don't think he sees it that way, and I don't think you'll be the same afterward. You don't think I could do it? Melissa had heard men threaten violence before, especially when she'd been with Chris. Most of the time, it was braggadocio, the way men talked, how they craved scars. But this was one of the times she believed it. One of those times when violence was spoken with a sense of promise, a dog's bared teeth. Movement upstairs before she could answer, rustling. Melissa and Eric looked at each other. I'll check on her, Melissa said. Ruby was sitting at the small kitchen table, Melissa's handbag in front of her. She wondered if Ruby had gone through it. Where's Dr. Steve? Melissa asked. He'll be here soon. Something about Ruby's simple sentence sounded ominous, but Melissa couldn't figure out why. I don't know why I didn't abort him. Melissa couldn't hide her surprise. It's not that I regret him, Ruby shrugged. I just didn't fall in love right away. When I found out I was pregnant, Jake's dad didn't stick around. I spent 9 months wondering if I should keep the baby, thinking about abortion and adoption. But I was so terrified by the idea of regret that I couldn't do anything. Too scared. Melissa noticed a similarity in Ruby and Jake, how they stared intently at her as they spoke, like they were studying her reactions. I was mad after he was born, Ruby went on. Mad at Jake's dad for leaving like I thought he would. Mad at myself for keeping Jake. I'd see these new mothers when I'd take them to the park across the street from our apartment, talking softly to their babies. I never felt that same way. But there was this moment when Jake was doing tummy time. You put a baby on his stomach and he's supposed to lift his neck to strengthen it. Jake was doing that and I was watching him and I heard this sound. I wasn't sure what it was. I leaned in close and I heard him and he was grunting. This little baby was struggling to raise his head and making this ugh sound, and that's it. That's when I fell in love. Maybe it's because I fell in love when he was struggling and I saw he needed help, but that was a moment. He became an actual person to me. Not something invisible inside me, not some crying body I had to take care of, but an actual person with a soul. He wasn't causing me pain. Melissa watched the way Ruby's thumb rubbed over her index finger as she spoke. I told myself I needed to make money, Ruby said. And I did. That's the truth. The Winterses gave me that. I didn't have Jake's father sending me anything. I didn't have family. I needed what they gave me. What they gave you? I'm not looking for forgiveness, Ruby said intensely. Not from you. What I did for the Winterses, and what I did to myself and Jake with all those years of drinking. All that's on me, and all I have is the Lord. I have him, and he hath me. Ruby rose from the table, went to the window. Jake left and returned, she said. The Lord teaches us to embrace the prodigal son, to vanquish ourselves of pride and accept, to even forgive ourselves of the sins we may commit on his behalf. Ruby turned toward Melissa. They're here, she said. Who? Melissa joined Ruby at the window. A man was approaching the house. He held a rifle. How? Melissa looked wildly around, as if she would find an answer. Ruby was already heading downstairs. Melissa wanted to scream, to run, to do something even if she had no idea what. She knew the basement was a bad idea, a place to be trapped, but Jake was there and she wasn't going to leave him. Melissa started down the stairs, remembered her handbag with her phone on the kitchen table. She ran back, grabbed her handbag, glanced out the window. The man stood in the dead garden, watching her. He lifted his rifle and fired. Chapter 26. Ruby. From the basement, Ruby heard the shot, and she heard Melissa shriek. She paused at the bottom of the stairs. "What was that?" Eric was standing next to Jake's unconscious body, one of Jake's arms dangling off the pool table. "The Winterses are here." "What?" Eric hurried to the stairs, called up. "Melissa?" No response. Ruby switched places with Eric to stand next to her son, used her foot to push the bag Eric had been standing next to under the table. She lifted Jake's hand, gently laid it at his side. A day hadn't passed in the last 4 years when Ruby hadn't thought about him. She'd actually tried calling him once and received the melodic 3-note notification that this number is no longer in service. The sudden realization that she had no means of contacting him left her frightened, almost panicked. And yet she'd resisted searching for him. Ruby didn't know if it was pride, but if it was, now she understood the relation of pride to sin. Pride had kept Ruby from her son, casting shadows in her mind, dispelling light. Melissa emerged at the top of the stairs, one hand on the railing, turning and pulling the door closed. Wildly rushed down. She ran into Eric and he grabbed her, tried to calm her, ask what happened. "I don't know," Melissa said. The weight of Eric's bag against her foot surprised Ruby. She knelt, opened it, pulled out the gun. Eric didn't seem the type to use a gun. Like Jake, there was a softness to him, a grasp of childhood he refused to let go. "What do we do?" Melissa was asking, and she turned toward Ruby. "Should we?" She and Eric saw the gun in Ruby's hand. And then Ruby slowly lifted her head, her eyes on the stairs. "And it came to pass after these things," Ruby said. "Eric?" Melissa turned toward him. But Eric just watched Ruby, even as Melissa grabbed his arm, even as a door handle turned. Eric watched her like a patient listening to their doctor's diagnosis. "Behold," Ruby whispered, "here I am." "What are you saying?" Melissa asked desperately. "Get thee into the land of Moriah." "What are you doing?" Melissa asked. "We need to save Jake, they're coming." Melissa was wild-eyed and off balance, as if she wanted to run but had no direction. "They're coming!" The door leading to the basement opened. Heavy footsteps on the stairs. Men's footsteps. Marley walked into the recreation room, looked around at Jake's wounded body on the table, Melissa scared next to him, Eric silent beside her. Ruby standing with a gun. "Ruby," Marley said. "Thank you." Ruby didn't respond. "What?" Melissa asked, her voice faint. 2 men followed Marley. One of them was gagged and blindfolded and bleeding. But even with the blindfold and bruises on his face, Ruby recognized Steve Debko. The other man had a shaved head, calm disposition, the bearing of former or active military. Surety to his movement, the casual way an athlete steps onto a field or a priest wanders among his congregation, as if this was where he belonged. He took Melissa by the arm, dragged her to the wall, forced her to the floor. Eric and Steve followed, albeit with less resistance. They were pushed down next to her. Steve looked around the room after his blindfold was removed. His eyes landed on Ruby. You told them where I was, Steve said uncertainly, as if he couldn't believe what he was saying. Your own son. You told them where we were. Her son will be fine, Marley said. And so will she. And they came to the place which the Lord had told him of, Ruby said. Where's Chris? Melissa asked desperately. I want to talk to Chris. Chris doesn't need to talk to you again, Marley said. And there Abraham built an altar. Where's Chris? Melissa asked again, as the bald military-looking man pulled a handgun out of his holster. He pointed it at Steve's head. Ruby had forgotten how loud a gunshot was, like the Lord clapping his hands together. Ruby heard Melissa's and Eric's screams after her hearing returned, faintly, like the screams were coming from another world, or a memory that had seeped into the present. And Ruby heard her own voice as Melissa wept, as the bald man raised his weapon at Melissa, as Steve's blood spread. And they came to the place which the Lord had spake of, and Abraham laid the wood, and stretched his son upon the altar. You don't, Melissa was saying, her face blurry tears. You don't. The gun swung wildly, and it took Ruby a moment to realize Eric had grabbed the other man's arms. It was a hopeless fight. The bald man had been surprised, but recovered quickly. He wrested the gun from Eric's grasp, spun it in his hand, whipped Eric's face with the handle. Eric fell back to the floor, stunned. Melissa was breathing hard, scared breaths, animal breaths. Marley just watched. The bald man pointed the gun at Eric. Do not lay a hand on the boy, Ruby said, but she knew they wouldn't listen to her. Eric looked toward Ruby, and she gazed back, and she wondered if Eric knew, in this last moment of his life, what had happened to his mother. It was as if she and Eric had spoken some instinctual language, and the word mother was present between them, as real as if the word had been carved from stone. A scared look overtook Eric's expression, his eyes wet, and he seemed like he wanted to say something. He tried to stand, but it was as if he'd forgotten how. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, Ruby said, and took the knife to slay his son. The Lord clapped. Ruby looked to the stairs as Eric's body slumped to the floor. Melissa was rushing up, a soul fleeing its body. But Ruby knew there was no salvation waiting for her. Chapter 27. Lucky. Lucky cheerfully parked his Jeep outside Steve Debko's house, stared at the AR-7 next to him, decided to leave it in the car. He wouldn't need a weapon for this. He'd assumed Ruby had brought Jake and Melissa here, particularly once he'd heard Jake was injured. A local hospital would have been too dangerous, and Jake was probably too hurt to travel much farther. He spotted Ruby's car parked down the street, the same old faded silver Corolla he remembered. Lucky's plan was to tell Ruby that she needed to leave. He was about to be questioned by the Winterses, and he'd have to give them some accurate information about her, enough to prove his loyalty. But he'd also help Ruby escape and leave breadcrumbs for the Winterses to follow, although those crumbs would be scattered in different directions. His faith would be proved. Ruby and her son would be safe, and Lucky would be able to return to his waiting family. A perfect plan. The front door opened as Lucky approached. His perfect plan shattered into 1,000 pieces. Looks like you and I both knew the kids were here, Marley said. Lucky wasn't sure how to respond. He tried not to stare at the silver-plated pistols holstered at Marley's waist. Come inside, Marley told him. I have something to show you. Lucky numbly followed Marley inside Debko's house. He hadn't been here for years, not since he'd helped Ruby find this place, a property that sat in the town of Cabin John, abandoned, too deep in disrepair to be attractive to anyone. A man was assembling a handgun in the kitchen. Lucky didn't recognize him, but he had a different bearing than the men normally associated with the Winterses. Former or current cop, maybe military.
"Lucky," Marley said. "Meet Spence."
Spence didn't acknowledge Lucky.
"How'd you find Ruby?"
Lucky asked Marley.
"She called Frank,"
Marley replied as he picked up his own gun, a chrome Beretta, and snapped in the clip.
"Gave up the girl in Debco in exchange for her and her son."
"Where's Ruby now?"
"Gone, with her son, but the girl escaped. Spence went looking for her. He's going back out soon."
Spence loaded his weapon with a snap.
"You knew Ruby, right?"
Marley asked casually. If Ruby had given up Melissa and Steve, Lucky wondered, had she also given him up? Had she betrayed him? All this time, Lucky had thought she'd left, that there was hope for him. No one escapes. He forced himself to stand still, fought the urge to lunge forward, to wrest the handgun free from Marley.
"I heard you two were tight,"
Marley went on. Lucky wasn't sure how to respond.
"This isn't the kind of business where you make friends,"
he said carefully. Marley's eyes glinted.
"It is, if you're honest."
Spence reached below the counter, brought up a shotgun, pumped the slide backward and forward. Something about the 2 clicks always reminded Lucky of a pause, the wait for a third.
"Do you want to know who else Ruby gave up?"
Marley asked. He knows. Lucky didn't move.
"You didn't bring a gun, did you?"
Marley went on instead of waiting for Lucky to answer. He tapped the handle of one of his pistols.
"Strange to come here and not bring a weapon."
Lucky was suddenly conscious of the closed pantry door behind him. He wondered if someone was inside, aiming a second shotgun at his back.
"Did you know Ruby helped Debco find this place?"
Lucky couldn't tell if these were real questions or if Marley was simply goading him.
"Hid him here from us. She owed him a favor, and he wanted out."
"Did she?" Lucky asked. His throat was so dry it was difficult to speak.
"Like I told you, I always heard you and Ruby were close,"
Marley said.
"What are you trying to say, Marley?"
Marley studied him with sharp eyes. Spence had finished with his weapons and was watching both men.
"I think," Marley said, "you came here to warn Ruby."
Nobody said anything for a moment.
"But you should have figured we were already here," Marley went on. "Come on, Lucky. We know you and Ruby were tight. We figured she'd turn to you."
Lucky couldn't stop thinking about the closed door behind him. His back ached.
"What were you thinking?"
Marley asked. It was one motion. Lucky bent and pulled the knife free from his ankle holster, lifted his hand to bring the blade down on Spence. Spence calmly stepped away. Lucky's knife cut air, nothing else. He could see out of the corner of his eye, Marley aiming one of his handguns at him, Spence raising his. Lucky turned sideways in between them, trying to keep an eye on both men. His heart was a wild dog trapped in a cage. He'd been wrong about everything. He'd imagined that Renee was going to wait for him to return, except that her murderous husband had turned a new corner. Their lives could resume. He'd imagined that the Winterses would allow him to walk away, let Lucky carry their secrets as casually as a knapsack slung over his shoulder. Now Lucky knew, intrinsically knew, that Renee had reached out to Mary Beth the moment he'd driven away from the cabin. Told her everything. They'd already run off, probably contacted the cops. And Lucky knew Marley was right. The Winterses had completely controlled him, tricked him, seen through everything he'd said and done, used him in the hopes of finding Ruby. Everyone had known he couldn't be trusted. "Sorry, Lucky," Marley said. "At least you'll go before your family will." Lucky's world went dark. He lay on the kitchen floor. Had he been shot? Was he his soul rising from his body? There'd been no sound after the lights flicked off and the gunfire, the two explosions boxing Lucky's ears after his desperate dive to the floor. Shadows in the darkness. Someone saying something. Marley, his words becoming clearer. "What happened to the lights? Who's there?" A door closed from somewhere distant. A shadow moved. Lucky squinted uselessly in the dark. The shadow moved into a square of light from the window, and Lucky saw Spence looking elsewhere. It was as if Marley and Spence had forgotten about Lucky after the power in the house had gone out. Or they thought he was dead. Lucky remembered a story he'd heard about a runner, on the verge of finishing a marathon, exhausted and barely conscious, who'd been shot in the back of the head during the last mile. The runner had been so tired that he hadn't even felt the bullet. He'd finished the race, and then, when he realized the onlookers were staring at him as he crossed the finish line, touched the back of his head and felt blood. Was he dying? Lucky wanted to touch his head, his chest, search for a wound, but didn't dare move. Spence walked over to Lucky, peered down, stared hard in the dark. "He still has the knife." This time Lucky wasn't too slow. He felt Spence's neck against his fist, the knife sunk to its handle. Lucky rose, looking for Marley, but Marley was already rushing him, crashing into him. Marley climbed over Lucky, grabbed his ears. The back of Lucky's head was slammed onto the kitchen floor. Silence. Darkness. Pain coming, but not yet present. Lucky's body was moving independently of his dazed mind, still fighting. Trying to grab Marley's hands as the back of his head was driven into the floor again. Something slashed his chin, and then came the pain, and then came nausea. A glint of light showed the gun in Marley's hand, lifted high, the handle wet from where it had whipped Lucky's face. But that meant, Lucky thought groggily, the other gun was still at Marley's waist. Lucky reached for it weakly, but Marley knocked Lucky's hands to the side, pulled his second gun free, pointed both down. "Your daughter's going to be first," Marley told him, "while your wife watches." "Counterpoint," a woman said. Marley was suddenly illuminated by a beam of light boring into his chest. He squinted into it as something whistled over Lucky, something black and hard crashing into Marley's right arm, that pistol skittering away. Marley cried out, lifted the other pistol, and fired blindly into the light. The gunshot deafened Lucky, a quick exhale of orange light from the muzzle. Lucky saw a shadow by Marley's side, and that second gun was suddenly lifted, like a parent pulling a helpless child, and Marley's wrist was turned and his hand opened and the pistol bounced to the floor next to Lucky's head. A boot kicked it away. Marley turned over, reached for the metal rod that had struck him, but another boot slammed down on his hand, flattened his fingers to the floor. A gloved hand reached down, picked up the metal, and Lucky saw it smash across Marley's mouth, a tooth and blood flying away. Marley listed to the side, fell out of the light. A flashlight clicked on, beamed up and down Marley's body, then Spence's, then jerked over the room before settling on Lucky's face. He squinted past the light, saw only one person standing behind it, and he realized who it was. "You saved me?" he asked. The harsh beam of light didn't waver. "It's too late to save anyone." Part 3. It is mine to avenge. I will repay. In due time their foot will slip, their day of disaster is near, and their doom rushes upon them. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 35. Chapter 28. Melissa. Melissa remembered a time when, as a child of 9, she'd been at a hotel with her mother, and Melissa had gone down to the lobby to buy a Coke. She'd returned to the elevator in the lobby, pressed the button for her floor, but a hand caught the doors before they closed. A man entered. Melissa had a disquieting feeling, the fear of being alone with a stranger. That feeling overwhelmed her when, after the elevator had begun to rise, he'd pressed the stop button. The elevator jerked and froze. Melissa couldn't speak. She just shrank into the corner. The man stepped in front of her, her eyes level with his belt, and placed his hands on the wall, one on either side of her head. "I'm sorry," she whispered. And then, by some automated function or remote access or miracle, the elevator lurched to a start, began to rise again. The man stepped away as the doors opened. A trio of people stepped on board. Melissa ran past them and raced down the hall. The man stayed behind. She didn't tell her mother what had happened, never told anyone. But she remembered it now, that feeling of helplessness. Her life at someone else's whim, someone stronger than her and more dangerous and desiring to take something from her. Someone driven by a force so strong Melissa felt she had no choice but to surrender. Melissa stumbled away from Dr. Steve's house and down the street, blindly panicked. She turned a corner and ducked behind the only other house on the road. She sank to the ground, between a brick wall and the bare branches of a shrub. Tried to corral her thoughts. Ruby had betrayed her, given her and Dr. Steve up to save herself and Jake. They'd murdered Eric. Was Jake safe? Ruby was with Jake and those 2 men from the Winterses, and she'd do everything she could to keep Jake safe. Melissa was confident of that. But then she remembered Ruby's words. "Do not lay a hand on the boy." A shiver rustled through her at the memory, the way the words came from somewhere ancient, and the men had blithely ignored her. The memory was madness. Something caught her eye, a figure passing under a street lamp. A man walking down the road, a hand plunged into his coat, the other shining a flashlight. One of the men from the basement. Melissa pressed against the brick. He looked in her direction. Melissa had a fear that she was about to accidentally shake the shrub in front of her, slip from her knelt position, cough, something to arouse his attention. But he turned and continued down the street, the flashlight's beam swinging left to right. Melissa exhaled. Her panic had almost left her dazed. She wanted to run around the side of this house, knock on the front door, beg for safety, for an ambulance, for the police. She wondered if the neighbors had heard the shots, if the cops had already been called. But the 2 houses on this street were separated by long lawns and clumps of trees, and the street was quiet, and the house lights were dark. There was no sign anyone had heard anything, or that anyone was even home. A car passed. Melissa assumed it was more men with the Winterses. Her stomach tightened at the idea. Those men deciding what to do with Jake, Ruby powerless to stop them. Men soon spiderwebbing into the streets, flashlights in one hand and weapons in the other, lights and bullets finding Melissa wherever she hid. She stayed crouched until her legs ached, scared to leave the safety of the shadows, finding fault with every idea that occurred to her. The only thing she could do was give herself up, hope that was enough to uphold whatever agreement Ruby had made to keep Jake safe. Melissa rose and she walked back to Dr. Steve's house. She felt numb inside. The distress of fate, weirdly reminded of the time she'd received that scholarship rejection, the way it seemed to reiterate that she would never obtain a bachelor's degree. The same certainty in Chris's voice when he assured Melissa that she was going to die, living in a controlled world, meeting whatever end others wanted for her. Ruby emerged from Dr. Steve's house. Jake's arm was over her shoulders, his feet dragging, stumbling sleepily. Melissa's heart surged. Somehow, Jake was with Ruby and alive. She watched Ruby struggle to sit Jake in her car. The taillights flicker on as the engine started, as they drove away. Jake was safe, but Melissa knew she wasn't. She hurried from the house, kept walking next to a narrow, hilly street, nothing but shadows of trees on either side, scurrying deep into them whenever headlights appeared. Movement gave Melissa strength, even if she wasn't sure where she was going. Chapter 29. Lucky. Lucky watched the vigilante finish tying up Marley in the kitchen. "I didn't think you were real," Lucky said again. The vigilante hadn't responded to him the first time. "Yeah, verily." The vigilante flicked open an automatic baton, opened the door leading to the basement. "Want to see the rest of the house?" Lucky did, and he stepped over Marley's unconscious body and Spence's corpse to follow her downstairs. Lucky wondered if the vigilante, a somehow mythic figure, discussed in hushed tones, was actually Melissa Cruz. The idea was a puzzle piece slipping neatly into place. The vigilante had crippled the Winterses, and it made sense that the person who had done that had insider information about the crime family. And no one had ever suspected, or would have suspected, that it was a woman. Only her voice and maybe her height revealed her sex. A canvas mask with 3 vertical stripes down the front concealed her head, and she wore a black hooded sweatshirt, dark gray jeans, and black boots. Gloves covered her hands. If she suddenly disappeared, Lucky couldn't have proved she'd even existed. In the basement, the vigilante knelt next to 2 bodies, executed sitting next to each other against a far wall. One was Dr. Steve Depko. The other was a young Asian man Lucky didn't recognize. The left half of his head was gone. "You know these 2? The vigilante asked Lucky. "One of them, Steve Debco." "Who was he?" "A doctor," Lucky explained. "My guess is he was treating Jake Smith. We were supposed to find him and his girlfriend." The baton rose, almost imperceptibly. "We?" the vigilante asked. "I worked with the Winterses," Lucky confessed. "I don't anymore." "Why not?" "I got tired of seeing things like this," he said. "Doing things like this. That's why Marley was trying to kill me." The baton lowered. The vigilante headed back up the stairs. Lucky followed her. He helped the vigilante carry Marley out into the dark, cold, quiet night, noticing how the vigilante stepped smoothly while Lucky strained. They reached an old Civic, and she unceremoniously dropped Marley's upper body on the street to open her trunk. Lucky lifted the other man on his own and, with a heave, dumped him inside. Marley was stirring awake, eyelids fluttering, but the vigilante reached into one of her pockets, pulled out a small case, and removed a syringe. Injected something into Marley's neck. Moments later, he was back asleep. "Well," the vigilante told Lucky and slammed the trunk shut. "I'm going to bounce." She climbed into the front seat of her car. Lucky stared after her, unsure what to do. In one day, his secrets had been exposed to his family and the Winterses. The former probably wanted nothing to do with him. The latter, to kill him. He needed help. And there was only one person who could help him. Lucky followed the vigilante. A couple of times he called Renee and Mary Beth, but neither of them answered or returned his messages. He wasn't worried that the Winterses had found them. The cabin was a secret, hidden and remote, and barely connected to Lucky. Renee and Mary Beth, he realized, must have run from him. Were too scared to even speak with him. And so Lucky drove in silence. The truth about Ruby dejected him. She had either been working for the Winterses this entire time, even after he thought he'd helped her escape, or perhaps she'd returned to them once Jake was in danger. In either case, she'd betrayed him. And Ruby was the only person he'd ever known who had left the Winterses. But in truth, no one had ever left. He was so lost in thought that he didn't realize nearly an hour had passed since he'd been following the vigilante. Lucky had been too distracted to pay attention to where they were driving, but he assumed that, by now, they were somewhere in Virginia. They drove onto a dirt road and then turned onto another, narrower road. An old, decrepit barn came into view. Lucky slowed to a stop in front of it, glanced around the empty lot. He had no idea where her car had gone, wondered if she'd driven into the barn. Lucky cursed himself for his distraction, his age, his carelessness, whatever had caused him to lose focus. His door was suddenly yanked open, and Lucky was pulled from the car. He caught himself on the dirt, palms burning from the impact. The vigilante stood above him, her striped mask lit by moonlight. "Why are you following me?" Lucky lifted himself slowly to his knees. "I need you to tell me how you've fought them. How you've won." The vigilante walked to her car, half hidden behind a pair of trees. She popped the trunk. "You want advice? Then give me another hand with this guy." "I can't work for them anymore," Lucky told her as he helped her pull Marley's bound body out of the trunk. Marley was still sleeping, and Lucky wondered what she'd drugged him with. "The Winterses aren't just going to let me go. They're going to come after me and my family." "Yeah, verily." The vigilante grunted as he dragged Marley out, dropped his body on the ground. She indicated the barn. "Over there." Lucky reached under Marley's arms. What?" Marley slurred. "Lucky?" Lucky ignored him as he and the vigilante half carried, half dragged Marley to the barn. Marley kept talking, his words becoming clearer, sentences filling out. "You double-crossed me," Marley said, struggling but feebly. The vigilante pushed open a door leading inside the barn with the back of her foot. "You're gonna die, Lucky," Marley said. "He's probably right," the vigilante agreed. "Also, your name is Lucky? Weird." The barn was dark, but the vigilante dumped her half of Marley on the floor and turned on a lantern next to the door. She walked around, lighting lanterns until a dim glow filled the space. This looked like the kind of structure that had been built as part of a larger property, and then that property had been torn down, the barn left for some other purpose that had never been realized until it was forgotten. It might have been, Lucky considered, a neglected historical landmark, a remnant of the slavery days that left Virginia's land drenched in blood. The floor was dirt, and the wooden walls were full of holes, some chewed by animals, some ripped by weather. The only thing in the barn that wasn't aged or rotted was on the other side of the room, and when Lucky saw it, he knew what the vigilante intended to do. "How have you stayed alive this entire time?" he asked her. The vigilante grabbed Marley's bound feet, dragged him across the dirt. "The secret's in being the hunter, not the hunted." "You're going to die too," Marley told her, and then he looked up, saw what waited. It was a gallows, 3 long brown boards. One had been plunged deep into the dirt. Another board protruded from its other end, close to 9 or 10 feet, the height of a basketball hoop. The third board was supportive, stretched at an angle between the other two. A small metal loop had been fixed to the end of the highest board, and a rope ran through it. A noose hung.
Lucky, help me.
Lucky ignored Marley. Are you ever going to stop? He asked the vigilante. 12 men from the Winterses were in a room when someone I loved died, she said. Marley was the last one there. He's the last one I needed to find.
What do you mean?
Marley asked. He was gaining strength as death neared.
What do you mean?
She pulled a rope hanging over a low rafter in the middle of the room. The noose rose. Marley had recovered enough to scream, so she grabbed a wadded ball of paper towels on the floor and stuffed them into his mouth. Talk to me, the vigilante told Lucky. What's your deal? Lucky told her about his early days with the Winterses, as he helped fasten the noose around Marley's neck, as she wrapped the other end of the rope around her hand and pulled it, slowly walking away, the rope over her shoulder. Lucky told her about the anguish he'd suffered recently as Marley's body rose and thrashed. And Lucky explained how he'd left the Winterses as the vigilante grunted, and Marley was lifted until his feet couldn't touch the ground. The vigilante wrapped her end of the rope around a hook on the wall. Well, Lucky, she said, rubbing her hands, staring up as Marley's body kicked. You sound like a real a-hole. I just need to make sure my family's safe. Is there anything I can do to help them? The vigilante didn't respond, just kept staring at Marley. She and Lucky looked up at him like people gazing at stars. Do you know who Medusa was? The vigilante asked after Marley's feet had finished kicking and his body hung like a pencil mark in the middle of a blank page. Greek myth turned people to stone with a look. Perseus cut off her head. That Medusa? That's the one. The vigilante walked back to the hook. You know, she went on, all those myths are really just stories about how people are supposed to act or behave. And I always thought Medusa was so interesting. A woman so powerful that just looking at her turned men into stone. That's crazy. I read up on her. There were no sounds except for the vigilante's voice. Medusa had 2 siblings, and she was the only one of them who was human, and she was beautiful. After the god, Poseidon, raped her in the temple of Athena, Athena was so mad about it that she changed Medusa into a monster so hideous that just seeing her turned men to stone. The vigilante started to unwrap the rope from the hook. And I was thinking about that. Why Medusa was turned into something so gross and violent. I think the truth is something different. Medusa froze men when they realized the evil of what they had done. Men looked at her and they couldn't look away. That was their curse. Marley's body fell to the ground like an invisible hand had thrown it. If you want to defeat them, Lucky, then you have to look at my face. You mean, Lucky asked, under the mask? The vigilante knelt, loosened the noose from Marley's neck. When I left who I was, she told Lucky, I lost everything in my life. My family was either killed or abandoned me. My friends are gone. Even though no one knew who I was, I couldn't keep these 2 sides separate after a while. You have to look at my true face. Lucky stared as the vigilante undid the noose. He didn't understand what she meant, but now he knew this couldn't be Melissa Cruz. This was someone with no connection to anyone in the world, and he felt an immense, overwhelming loneliness at that thought. I still don't get it, Lucky said. You have to look at my true face, the vigilante said a 3rd time, and she turned toward him. That's the only way you can be helped. He just stared at her mask, into the 3 black stripes, the stains that darkened it like water. I think it's too late for you, the vigilante said. Chapter 30. Jake. Sunrise battered Jake's face. Pain throbbed through his chest so much that it hurt to breathe. He didn't feel like he could sit up and didn't try. Instead, he gingerly touched the source of the ache, felt the soft cotton of a wrapping and the coarse texture of medicinal tape. He recognized the arched ceiling above him. Ruby's bedroom. That was enough to tell him where he was. Enough to tell him, finally, they were safe. Somehow he knew it. Jake marveled at that. Billions of tiny experiences happen over a lifetime, sights and sounds and smells, yet it's the moments from childhood and adolescence that remain. He couldn't even figure out how he remembered the ceiling. Maybe summer days when Ruby was drunk or asleep, and he would come up here and watch television. Jake tried to sit up, and his shoulder felt like a saw was chewing through it. He gently rolled to his side, taking deep breaths as the pain subsided to something manageable. Lowered himself to the floor. Jake stayed still for a few minutes, then lifted himself from his hands and knees, teeth gritting. I can stand. He did. I can walk. Barely. Jake crept to the bedroom door, paused at the full-length mirror hanging on its back. He was shirtless, just that white bandage over his shoulder. He looked even more gaunt than normal. He'd always been naturally thin, but now his stomach was withdrawn, sunken. He still had on the same jeans he'd been wearing over the last several days, and, Jake realized with embarrassment, at some point he'd peed on himself. He wondered if Ruby still had some of his clothes here, if he could even fit into them anymore. Jake doddered down the hall, his hand pressed against the wall for balance. Ruby was sitting at the kitchen table, a coffee cup next to her. Hey, Jake said. He was suddenly aware of his breath after days of unbrushed teeth, and grimaced. Ruby didn't look up. Jake walked around her and the table to the chair on the other side, using the kitchen counter for support. The kitchen had changed. There always used to be a half-empty bottle of something alcoholic on the counter. At first, Ruby had hidden the bottles, and then they'd been left out as her drinking had increased. Jake used to sip from them when he was 10 or 11 or 12, shyly and secretly, just tasting the brown liquid. He didn't enjoy the taste or the uneven feeling afterward, but he did like the way his face contorted, like eating a sour candy. Not something you tasted because it felt good, but because it didn't. Those bottles were gone now. Jake assumed Ruby had hidden them, hoping to present some sort of dignified appearance to him and Melissa. Not that Ruby had ever cared what people thought of her, but Jake could sense a change in her. It was in the house. The sign above one of the windows in the kitchen that read, "He hath blessed this home." The pictures he'd passed in the hall from the bedroom to the kitchen, colored illustrations, 6 on each side, depicting Jesus as he was being led to his own crucifixion. The Bible on her nightstand, a rosary draped over the cover. Jake couldn't remember a time when Ruby had mentioned religion, but he wasn't surprised she'd found it. She'd always been given to excess, attracted to the idea of surrendering to something greater than herself. The Winterses, alcohol, God. Jake pulled out the chair and sat, carefully, his breathing louder as he lowered, a sudden moment of pain nearly causing him to cry. Ruby's head was down, eyes closed. Her lips were moving, but she wasn't saying anything he could hear. A rosary was in her hands, beads passing through fingers. She'd aged. A little heavier, her face rounder, thinner hair. After a few minutes, her lips and hands stopped moving. A cross dangled off the rosary, and Ruby brought it to her lips, kissed it, opened her eyes. You have a rosary in the kitchen and one in the bedroom? Jake asked. Why 2? Prayer emergencies? I was praying for you. Where's Melissa? Not here. She went out? Something about Ruby's pause made Jake uneasy. She left you. Jake felt a flash of alarm and pain. What? The Winterses came and she ran off. You were asleep. Steve had put you under. You didn't wake up when they were there. The comfort Jake had felt had vanished, his world overturned. Steve, the doctor? A rosary bead between her fingers, her fingertips pressed against it. Steve didn't make it. Where's Melissa? The beads continued. Not sure. They're looking for her. We have to find her. We're far from wherever she is, Ruby told him. In a different state. Jake was standing, hands on the table for support, crumbs under his palms, tiny points pressing into his flesh before crumbling. You left her? She left you. She's in trouble. They could have her. Jake couldn't stay still any longer. He had to do something. He gripped the edge of the table and his legs buckled. Ruby set the beads on the table, the rosary curled. Jake, she said slowly, I need to tell you something, and it's not going to be easy to hear. You should sit down. What? It's about Eric. Eric? The word so faint it seemed like someone else had spoken it, someone far away. They killed him. A demon writhed inside Jake's chest, tried to pull itself through his ribs, through the bullet wound, tear itself free. How did we? They showed mercy. I begged for your life, and so they showed mercy. But I have been told that, after we left, they were attacked by an old friend of mine, Lucky Wilson. He was with the vigilante. Jake felt like he was swimming under a sheet of ice and searching for air. Was it Chris? He asked. Did Chris kill Eric? It was his men. There was something in Ruby's voice that Jake remembered, something plain-spoken and honest, the same way he remembered the ceiling in her bedroom. The way, when he was a child, she'd calmly tell him at night, Stay here, I'll be back, and she always was. The tone she took when something needed to be believed. I was asleep through Eric? Like I said, Steve gave you medicine for the pain. I have it here. We have to find Melissa. I have to find her. I have to go back. I can't lose her, too. I think it's too late, Jake, Ruby said. Jake's breathing worsened, breath coming loud, wheezing. Ruby stood and her arms were open and around him. He nearly sank to the floor. She held him up. Chapter 31. Melissa. The door was open, but the chapel was empty. A sign outside listed a 7 a.m. service. Melissa didn't wear a watch, and her phone and handbag were in Dr. Steve's basement, but the light from daybreak led her to assume services were close to starting. Melissa slipped inside. Didn't see anyone watching her as she closed the door. It had been years since Melissa had been inside a church. Her mother made her go every Sunday, communions and confessions and Sunday school, standing next to her and singing loudly as Melissa mumbled along. There had always been that distance between the two of them, and Melissa wondered if it affected her relationship with religion, her reluctance, a reaction to her mother's urges. Truthfully, Melissa had always felt a calling to church, some compulsion that may have come from all those hours of kneeling in pews, or the surety her mother and the priests and her Sunday school teachers had in their beliefs, or the beauty of the congregation slowly walking forward to receive communion, their heads humble and bowed. The embrace of Jesus, the grateful abandonment of an exhausted life.
This is the end of disc number 6. Please insert disc number 7.